One kingdom for centuries, then colony, then peninsula split when liberation arrived. Foreign armies divided Korea at the 38th parallel in 1945. Temporary, they promised. 5 years later, war erupted. Brothers fought across frozen mountains until armistice froze the conflict without resolution. Seoul glows with idols and technology, while Pyongyang marches in disciplined formations. Families remain separated by the world's most fortified border. Two nations claiming one heritage follow paths so divergent that reunification feels both inevitable and impossible. A division meant to last months approaches 80 years, carried in memory by millions who share a homeland neither fully claims. Late in the 19th century, the Korean peninsula still carried the rhythms of a dynasty that believed stability came from continuity. Court officials moved through quiet corridors lined with lacquered screens. Records of past reigns arranged with careful precision. Ministers debated policy under the strict etiquette of a Confucian order that had guided the country for centuries. In those chambers, the belief persisted that balance with neighboring powers would hold as long as old arrangements remained in place. Yet beyond the palace walls, that sense of permanence was already starting to fracture. Farmers in distant villages felt the first tremors long before the court acknowledged them. Seasons had grown harsher, tax burdens heavier, and rumors of officials enriching themselves passed from one household to the next. Families who once counted on tradition to protect them watched unrest spread from province to province. Groups of peasants gathered in shaded groves to voice anger about corruption, or to demand reforms that promised a fairer future. Their frustrations fueled movements that had no single leader, but shared a common desire to challenge a system that no longer served them. Far from the capital, travelers arriving from treaty ports in Japan, Russia, or China brought tales of new machines, reorganized armies, and radical ideas tearing apart old empires. Merchants returning from Manchurian markets spoke of soldiers marching in unfamiliar uniforms. Missionaries carried printing presses and textbooks filled with knowledge that challenged the closed world Korea had built for itself. Every arrival chipped away at the belief that isolation could hold back the world's advance. These disruptions were small at first, yet each marked another step toward a crossroads the peninsula could no longer avoid. Inside the royal court, disagreements hardened into factions. Some argued that the kingdom must reform, modernize its farms, strengthen its military, and open selected ports to foreign trade. Others insisted that stepping outside established order would invite disaster. These factions met in dimly lit rooms, where advisors traced possible futures on maps spread across polished tables. Every choice seemed to threaten the delicate balance that had preserved sovereignty for generations. The old guardians of custom wanted to keep foreign influence at bay, while younger officials saw opportunity in selective adaptation. Neither group fully recognized that events beyond their borders were already deciding Korea's fate. Meanwhile, great powers circling East Asia began watching the peninsula with newly sharpened interest. Each regarded Korea as strategically vital, not because it was wealthy, but because it lay between larger ambitions. A rising empire to the east sought security and influence after rapid modernization. A northern state still shaped by earlier conquests looked southward for new access to warm waters, and in the west, a once dominant dynasty struggled to hold its crumbling sphere together. The peninsula's geography had always mattered, but now it became a bargaining chip in rivalries growing fiercer by the year. Diplomats arrived with offers cloaked as friendship. They wrote treaties in ornate script, promising protection or cooperation, while hiding intentions behind polite language. Some envoys whispered warnings about rivals preparing to strike. Others urged Korea to align with them to preserve autonomy. Court scribes recorded each proposal, unsure which path carried greater danger. For centuries, the kingdom had managed these relationships carefully, offering tribute when required and asserting independence when possible. But the old formula of respectful distance no longer matched the pace of change sweeping through East Asia. As tensions rose, reformers within Korea attempted to strengthen institutions weakened by long dependency on tradition. They pushed for military reorganization, believing that modern weapons and new training would provide leverage in negotiations with neighboring powers. Armories were inspected, uniforms redesigned, and foreign instructors invited to teach. Yet these efforts often collided with internal resistance. Commanders accustomed to inherited authority distrusted unfamiliar techniques, fearing they would lose influence if reforms succeeded. Soldiers were caught between conflicting orders, unsure whose commands carried legitimacy. Progress moved slowly, too slowly for a peninsula that needed urgent transformation. While officials argued, small groups of scholars and merchants formed networks to introduce new ideas from abroad. They opened study circles in quiet rooms above markets, reading foreign newspapers or learning new languages. These gatherings offered a glimpse of possible futures: constitutional government, industrial expansion, and expanded participation in public life. Rumors of these circles reached the palace, causing unease among conservative ministers who saw them as threats to order. Yet even they recognized that isolation had become impossible. The question was how to engage the world without losing sovereignty. Growing unrest among commoners forced the government to act. Peasant groups organized more openly, demanding relief from unjust taxation and corrupt officials. Some movements carried regional grievances. Others aimed to protect traditional beliefs from what they saw as foreign intrusion. Local uprisings spread across farmlands that had once been quiet. Governors requested reinforcements, and messengers raced to the capital carrying urgent reports. These uprisings revealed how deeply social strain had cut across society, and how unprepared the dynasty was to respond effectively. International eyes followed these disturbances closely. Nearby empires saw instability as an invitation to extend influence under the guise of restoring order. Advisors in rival capitals debated how far they could push their claims without provoking conflict with one another. The peninsula's internal turmoil offered opportunities none of them intended to ignore. Each maneuvered to place advisors near the throne or secure economic concessions, confident that a weakened Korea would yield under pressure. What officials in Seoul perceived as temporary domestic unrest appeared to others as the opening of a long-awaited contest. Pressure escalated further when neighboring powers clashed directly over control of East Asia. Battles erupted far from the Korean border, yet their outcomes reshaped the region's balance of power. Victories and defeats abroad sent shockwaves into the peninsula, undermining old alliances and strengthening new ones. As one empire's prestige declined, another rose swiftly, altering diplomatic calculations overnight. Korean officials watched these developments anxiously, aware that whichever power prevailed would soon try to redefine Korea's status. Reformers used this moment to insist on urgent change. They argued that the peninsula must adopt modern institutions or risk being carved apart by stronger neighbors. Their proposals included new schools, restructured ministries, and improved trade routes to stabilize the economy. These ideas inspired hope among younger generations, but alarmed conservative factions who feared losing the familiar world they had defended for centuries. Tension grew not just between Korea and external powers, but within Korea itself, as debates over modernization turned into power struggles. As domestic politics became more fractious, foreign pressure intensified. Rival diplomats monitored every shift in the court, offering covert support to factions they believed would advance their interests. Some envoys supplied weapons or advisors to groups sympathetic to their cause. Others bribed officials to block reforms that might weaken their leverage. Korea's internal disagreements became intertwined with foreign agendas, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish national decisions from external manipulation. Even with these challenges, voices within the palace still hoped for a path forward that preserved unity and sovereignty. Advisors proposed balanced diplomacy, maintaining cautious engagement with each power while avoiding commitments that could draw the kingdom into war. They believed that careful negotiation could buy time to stabilize the country and complete essential reforms. But such efforts required internal cohesion, something the court was rapidly losing. Every compromise sparked new disputes, and every delay allowed foreign influence to deepen. In rural provinces, ordinary people sensed the uncertainty in their own way. Some watched unfamiliar uniforms appear in port cities, accompanied by foreign merchants whose goods seemed both enticing and unsettling. Others noticed local officials enforcing new rules inspired by foreign models. These changes appeared uneven, confusing, and often disruptive. Families who had endured generations of hardship now wondered whether forces beyond their control would determine their future. The peninsula felt as though it was drifting toward a turning point, without anyone guiding its course. As the century neared its close, Korea's long-standing tributary relationship with its western neighbor weakened dramatically. Dynastic turmoil, military defeats, and mounting internal problems left that once dominant empire unable to protect its former sphere. This collapse of influence created a vacuum that competing powers rushed to fill. For Korea, the shift was monumental. A long-standing anchor of regional order had faded, leaving the peninsula exposed to ambitions it could no longer manage through diplomacy alone. That vacuum intensified rival claims from the north and the east. Newly strengthened states, eager to secure strategic advantage, regarded Korea's location as vital to their own survival. Each believed that if a competitor gained exclusive influence there, it would threaten their security. That calculation transformed the peninsula into the center of a struggle far larger than itself. The court understood this danger, but lacked the unified leadership and military strength required to counter it. By the end of this era, the foundation of the Old Kingdom was no longer able to hold the weight of events pressing against it. Internal divisions, external ambitions, and accelerating change converged into a single crisis. Korea had attempted to navigate between powerful neighbors for generations, relying on tradition, diplomacy, and cautious adaptation. Now those strategies were failing. What remained was a peninsula standing at the edge of forces it could no longer deflect, caught between reformers demanding transformation and foreign powers preparing to impose their own vision on its future. The final years of the 19th century closed with a fragile kingdom struggling to preserve sovereignty, while the world around it reshaped itself with unprecedented speed. Old certainties had collapsed, new pressures mounted from every direction, and Korea's leaders faced a challenge unlike any they had known. Ahead lay decisions that would redefine the peninsula for generations and open the path toward the division and upheaval still far beyond sight. When imperial officials arrived on Korean soil in the early 20th century, they carried an air of certainty that unsettled even those ministers accustomed to foreign pressure. Their uniforms, polished to a precise sheen, hinted at an organized strength that contrasted sharply with the fractured state of the peninsula. Port cities felt their presence first. Officers walked through narrow alleys, mapping every street, measuring storehouses, and inspecting harbors, with the confidence of men already imagining the region under their control. Curiosity and apprehension followed them wherever they went. Inside government halls, the court attempted to deny the gravity of the situation. Advisors insisted that negotiations could restrain outside ambitions, that treaties could prevent deeper intrusion. Yet every passing month revealed how limited those strategies had become. Diplomats from the rising empire pressed for concessions in administration, trade, and law, presenting their demands as necessary for regional stability. These proposals carried the shape of inevitability. Refusal invited consequences no official dared to test. Korea found itself maneuvering through decisions shaped by external timetable rather than its own. Reform-minded scholars recognized that the peninsula's autonomy was slipping away. They had long urged the adoption of stronger institutions to resist encroachment, but their arguments now carried a sharper urgency. Workshops were open to teach modern printing, engineering, or military techniques, each project intended to strengthen the country's ability to negotiate from a position of confidence. Yet these efforts were constantly overshadowed by increasing interference from the imperial administration, which stationed advisors in key ministries and quietly influenced appointments at every level. Local communities sensed the shift through more immediate changes. New police stations appeared along roadways connecting market towns. Regulations arrived with unfamiliar wording, printed in languages many villagers had never seen. Farmers transporting rice to sell found themselves questioned by uniformed patrols, demanding proof of ownership or permission to travel. Merchants who had once bargained freely in bustling markets now faced inspectors tallying goods with dispassionate precision. These intrusions slowly became woven into daily life, signaling that the old order had been replaced by something far more assertive. Urban streets transformed fastest. Construction crews tore down sections of aging neighborhoods to create administrative quarters modeled after foreign cities. Electric lines stretched between newly built offices. Rail tracks extended across hillsides, linking resource-rich regions to ports favored by the new rulers. Factories rose near these lines, drawing workers from distant villages who hoped steady wages might ease the hardship of taxation. Smoke curled from tall chimneys into skies once dominated by the crescent roofs of traditional homes. For many, this modernization felt like a future they had not chosen but were required to follow. Cultural pressure soon accompanied political restructuring. Schoolchildren found their lessons rewritten to emphasize loyalty to new authorities. Textbooks arrived showing foreign heroes, foreign victories, and foreign customs celebrated as superior examples. Children recited songs that praised a distant emperor. Teachers instructed them in a language unfamiliar to their parents. Families who gathered at night around low tables listened as sons and daughters repeated words that carried meanings, unlike those spoken in their homes for generations. These shifts unsettled elders, who feared traditions would vanish under imposed uniformity. Officials responsible for enforcing cultural assimilation extended these changes beyond classrooms. Signs written in the local script were replaced with new lettering. Birth records were modified, and citizens were urged or pressured to adopt names reflecting the empire's identity. Public buildings displayed banners with slogans that celebrated unity under foreign rule. Festivals once dedicated to seasonal cycles or ancestral rites were discouraged or reshaped to honor different histories. People complied out of caution, not conviction, aware that resistance could bring severe consequences. Yet despite these pressures, Determination to preserve identity ran beneath the surface. Some families hid banned books beneath floorboards, or passed stories orally to avoid losing them. Scholars gathered in discreet circles to study old texts out of sight of inspectors. Musicians performed traditional songs quietly in courtyards, their melodies softened to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Every act of preservation, however small, became a gesture of resilience in an era of enforced transformation. Resistance also grew in more organized forms. Student groups circulated pamphlets criticizing colonial rule, risking arrest for possessing materials deemed subversive. Workers in industrial cities formed clandestine associations to discuss grievances about labor conditions. Farmers, angered by land policies, found solidarity in local gatherings, where frustrations were shared in hushed tones. Some joined underground movements committed to striking back, traveling across borders to seek training, allies, or refuge. Their paths were fraught with danger, yet these efforts helped shape a wider network of opposition that spread across the peninsula. Beyond Korea's shores, exiles carried the struggle into foreign capitals. Activists delivered speeches to audiences who knew little about the peninsula, but who responded to appeals for justice and autonomy. Diplomatic circles in distant countries received petitions detailing abuses occurring under colonial rule. Some exiles wrote newspapers or established schools to preserve language and history among diaspora communities. These efforts kept the idea of an independent future alive, even when conditions at home made open resistance nearly impossible. On the peninsula, public demonstrations eventually erupted with force that surprised even those who organized them. Crowds filled major streets, holding banners crafted from kitchen cloths and handwriting inked late into the night. Voices rose in unified demand for national sovereignty. Shops closed in solidarity. Students left classrooms to join marches that stretched further each day. Though peaceful, the gatherings met swift suppression. Patrols advanced with batons, arrests followed, and prison cells overflowed. Yet the memory of these demonstrations refused to fade, inspiring others who had witnessed the resolve on display. Colonial authorities responded by tightening control. Surveillance increased across cities, and informants operated in markets and taverns. Village leaders were pressured to report dissent, while police stations kept detailed records of anyone suspected of organizing resistance. These measures weighed heavily on ordinary people, fostering an atmosphere where trust was fragile and conversations cautious. Still, the desire for autonomy persisted, held quiet but unbroken. Despite repression, certain sectors grew under colonial rule. Industrial output expanded rapidly, fueled by large-scale extraction of minerals and increased factory production. Roads, ports, and rail networks connected remote regions to coastal hubs with unprecedented efficiency. Many of these developments favored imperial needs rather than local prosperity, yet they reshaped the peninsula's economic landscape permanently. Laborers gained new skills, engineers learned to maintain modern machinery, and merchants adapted to trade patterns directed toward foreign markets. Even under harsh oversight, society absorbed technologies that would later play roles in post-colonial reconstruction. As global conflict intensified during the early 20th century, the peninsula was drawn deeper into the imperial war effort. Young men were conscripted for military service, some sent far from home to fight in campaigns they knew little about. Women and girls were coerced into roles that brought immense suffering, taken from their villages under false promises and subjected to conditions that scarred families for generations. Factories shifted to wartime production, demanding long hours and relentless output. The already heavy burden placed on the population grew heavier still. By the time the global conflict approached its final years, exhaustion permeated Korean society. Fields lay untended in some regions as workers were redirected to industry families, endured shortages of food, clothing, and fuel. Rumors of defeat circulated quietly even before official announcements reached the peninsula. When imperial authority finally collapsed, its departure was abrupt. Soldiers retreated, administrators fled, and governors abandoned offices long associated with severity and control. Streets once patrolled by a confident foreign force fell silent almost overnight. Yet liberation did not bring immediate relief. With colonial administrators gone, there was no functioning central authority capable of managing food distribution, public safety, or basic governance. Schools lacked teachers familiar with older curricula, and local offices struggled to record property claims disrupted by decades of expropriation. Villages attempted to restore order on their own, but lacked coordination. Into this vacuum stepped forces arriving from the north and south, each representing distant powers with their own visions for the peninsula's future. Communities waited anxiously for clarity about what independence would mean after 35 years of colonial rule. Some celebrated in the streets with songs that had long been suppressed. Others feared new forms of control might replace the old. The countryside echoed with conflicting messages, calls for unity, warnings of ideological battles, and rumors of foreign soldiers approaching from opposite directions. People who had endured decades of domination sensed that another turning point was unfolding, one shaped not by their own choices, but by decisions made far beyond the peninsula. By the close of this era, the structures imposed under colonial rule had left deep marks on every aspect of life. Political authority had been centralized, the economy reorganized around resource extraction, and cultural identity challenged by forced assimilation. Yet beneath these layers, the desire to reclaim sovereignty remained strong. Korea stood newly freed, yet vulnerable, with great powers already positioning themselves to shape the next chapter. The peninsula had emerged from one form of domination, only to face forces that would soon divide it in ways no one could yet imagine. Heat pressed down over fields and alleyways in 1945, when word began to slip quietly through the peninsula that the empire ruling it was faltering. Traders mentioned shattered fleets and burned-out cities over bowls of rice in roadside inns. Dock workers heard sailors mutter about looming defeat as warships limped into harbors. Few dared to trust these fragments of news. For 35 years, hopes had risen and fallen, without changing who gave orders at police stations and government offices. Clarity arrived suddenly through loudspeakers and radios. Announcers read formal statements that Japan had accepted surrender. People stopped in mid-step to listen. Some stared at the ground, hands trembling. Others ran to find family members, blurting out the news without knowing what it truly meant. In some villages, elders ordered ancestral tablets brought out so families could bow in thanks. In cities, flags hidden for decades were pulled from trunks and shaken free of dust. Celebration erupted in bursts, then faded into silence as a new question formed in nearly every mind. Who would rule tomorrow? Colonial administrators had their own answer. Many burned documents, packed valuables, and vanished toward coastal embarkation points. Offices that had functioned with rigid discipline only days earlier now sat half empty. Telephone lines went unanswered. Trains scheduled with mechanical precision failed to arrive. Korean clerks stood behind abandoned desks, clutching ledgers that no longer meant anything. A structure that had seemed immovable dissolved in a shockingly short time. Communities tried to fill the void. Local leaders convened hurried meetings in schools and temples to organize neighborhood patrols. Farmers volunteered to guard storehouses so rice would not disappear into the hands of black marketeers. Young men who had once hidden from colonial police now walked openly with armbands, directing traffic and mediating disputes. These improvised committees could not rebuild a state, but they kept panic from spiraling into chaos, while people waited to see which power would arrive first. North of the Central Mountains, engines rumbled as Soviet columns crossed the border. Armored vehicles rolled along dusty roads past bewildered villagers. Commanders set up field headquarters in former police stations, hanging new banners where imperial symbols had been. Translators delivered orders announcing that arms had to be surrendered and curfews observed. For many locals, the uniforms and language were entirely new, yet the posture of authority felt familiar enough. Another force had come, convinced it knew how things should be run. At southern ports, American ships loomed on the horizon. Soldiers disembarked with crates of equipment, field radios, and stacks of documents that presumed a clear command structure where none existed yet. Officers moved into large buildings previously occupied by colonial governors, spreading maps across tables to study the geography of a land they barely knew. Their mission orders framed the region as a former enemy territory, needing occupation and stabilization, rather than as a liberated country regaining its own agency. Most Koreans had not been asked whether they wanted either army there. Still, reactions varied. Some believed foreign troops might protect the peninsula from being seized entirely by one neighbor. Others, remembering centuries of outside interference, saw only another form of intrusion dressed in different colors. Over courtyard walls and in market stalls, people repeated the same uneasy thought. After 35 years of rule from Tokyo, decisions were again being made elsewhere. The shape of those decisions had already been sketched in distant offices before the first foreign boots touched Korean soil. 2 American officers, pressed for time and working from a map, had suggested the 38th parallel as a convenient line to divide responsibility for accepting Japanese surrender. The proposal went to superiors, was passed to Moscow, and received an unexpected quick agreement. That line, drawn with little knowledge of local realities, cut through mountain ranges, communities, and supply routes, turning a cartographer's convenience into a boundary that would soon feel very real. Villages lying near that latitude suddenly found themselves on different sides of an invisible barrier. Relatives who owned land together across adjoining valleys now reported to separate occupation commands. Letters and messengers began to face checkpoints. What had been one continuous landscape became 2 zones governed by officers speaking different languages and guided by different priorities. Official statements insisted the arrangement was temporary, yet residents could already feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. In the northern zone, Soviet officers moved quickly to establish working relationships with Koreans who had opposed colonial rule. Activists who had survived in hiding, exile, or prisons stepped into daylight to form people's committees. These bodies took charge of local administration, allocating food, reopening workshops, and debating land redistribution. Factories whose machinery had served imperial interests resumed production under new slogans painted hastily on their walls. The tone combined revolutionary fervor with tight supervision from Soviet advisors who understood that a friendly government here would strengthen their security position in East Asia. South of the parallel, American commanders pursued a different approach. Their primary concerns were order and the prevention of perceived left-wing uprisings. Provisional authorities often included figures linked to older landholding classes or conservative factions that seemed reliable to the occupation. Many independence activists who expected to lead in a new era found themselves sidelined or treated with suspicion if their politics did not match Washington's preferences. Street rallies calling for immediate nationwide elections met police batons rather than support. Food scarcity tightened pressure in both zones. Years of war, requisition, and disruption had already strained harvests. Now, with transportation networks damaged and administrative systems scrambled, getting grain from farm to city became a struggle. In the north, requisition teams organized by committees and overseen by Soviet officers collected rice and barley, promising equitable distribution, but sometimes provoking anger when quotas felt impossible. In the South, American authorities tried to stabilize prices through rationing, while relying on imported supplies that never seemed to arrive fast enough. Families queued with ration cards, eyes fixed on sacks of grain that might run out before their turn came. Schools reopened under new auspices. In northern classrooms, teachers retired the colonial curriculum and replaced it with lessons that emphasized workers, peasants, and anti-imperialist struggle. Portraits of revolutionary leaders hung beside chalkboards, and students learned songs celebrating collective effort. In southern cities, textbooks revised hastily now featured different heroes, figures associated with constitutionalism, Christian reform, or American-style democracy. English words crept into vocabulary lists. A child's education began to depend less on region or class and more on which side of the parallel the school stood. Commerce adapted as well. Markets under Soviet oversight introduced new regulations, favoring producers aligned with people's committees. Barter beyond official channels sometimes risked being labeled hoarding or speculation. Farther south, merchants adjusted to American currency controls and attempts to revive pre-war financial institutions. Smugglers exploited gaps between systems, moving goods across the line at night. Rice going one way, manufactured items the other, earning profits from the widening difference between the two zones' rules. Political discussions responded to these new realities. In the north, committee meetings filled with debates over how far land reform should go and what position Korea should adopt toward neighboring socialist states. In the south, rallies and newspapers argued over the proper balance between tradition and change, criticizing both old elites and occupation policies. Many voices on both sides still insisted that all these experiments were temporary steps toward a single independent state, but each month of separate administration planted deeper roots. Efforts to coordinate a joint future continued in fits and starts. Commissions formed by Soviet and American diplomats met in large rooms, heavy with cigarette smoke and guarded optimism. Delegations from Korean political groups submitted proposals for unified elections or interim governments. Every plan had to pass through the filter of global rivalry that was hardening rapidly into what would be called the Cold War, where one side saw a promising nationalist, the other often saw a potential proxy for its rival. Agreements announced after these meetings sounded hopeful on paper, yet rarely translated into real cooperation on the ground. Ordinary people rarely had access to the details of such negotiations. What they experienced instead were the immediate consequences of competing visions around them. One household might hear a committee representative explain why land would be broken up and redistributed. Another might listen to an American officer describe the need to build a stable, anti-communist administration. Families visiting relatives just a few valleys away discovered that slogans, regulations, and even public holidays had begun to diverge. Despite these changes, many Koreans clung to the belief that unity remained possible. Writers launched newspapers calling for a broad national conference above faction and ideology. Religious leaders organized prayer meetings and discussion circles that welcomed participants from every region. Former guerrillas, students, and village elders shared stories of common suffering under colonial rule, insisting that this shared memory could form the basis for a single government. Their conviction drew on 1,000 years of history as one political and cultural space. Yet every week brought new signs that the occupation zones were hardening into more than temporary expedients. Police structures in the south recruited and trained officers loyal to emerging conservative parties. Security organs in the north fused with party organizations that drew guidance from Moscow. Militia units formed, political prisoners were taken on both sides, and the rhetoric of moderate compromise slowly gave way to talk of enemies, subversion, and looming confrontation. Farmers watching these developments from their fields had simpler concerns. They needed to know who would collect taxes, who would protect irrigation systems, and whether sons taken into new security forces would ever return urban families, weighed whether to stay put, move north in hopes of land, or move south in hopes of trade and access to foreign goods. Each choice felt permanent, even if officials still insisted that the division was no more than a temporary measure. Evenings in many towns followed a similar pattern. Lamps flickered on, radios crackled with announcements from occupation authorities, and neighbors gathered in small groups to talk over the day's news. Stories of arrests in one district, of reforms in another, of proposed elections or cancelled talks spread from house to house. People measured their words carefully, aware that every side now kept close watch for unreliable elements. Freedom from colonial rule had arrived, but a new kind of tension settled over conversations. The moment that had begun with fireworks of sudden liberation gradually turned into a long, uneasy pause. Japan's flags were gone, yet 2 sets of foreign uniforms still filled the streets. Committees, parties, and councils multiplied, each claiming to represent the true will of the nation, while looking over their shoulders toward distant patrons. Trains now stopped at checkpoints where new flags fluttered. On either side of that line, people woke up each morning to rules shaped less by what they wanted than by which power had reached their village first. In farmsteads and alleyways, mothers still called children in for supper, millstones still turned, and fishermen still raced the tides. Daily life continued because it had to, but beneath that surface, an unspoken understanding spread. The struggle to reclaim independence had succeeded only halfway. Foreign commands had replaced colonial directives. 2 systems were taking shape where only one country had existed before. Nobody yet knew what that would ultimately mean, but a feeling settled over many households that this time the peninsula might not emerge from outside interference in one piece. Morning light filtered into crowded meeting rooms in northern towns, where newly formed people's committees gathered again to debate land, labor, and local authority. These gatherings had sprung up spontaneously in the final weeks of 1945, but by the following year they operated with a confidence that revealed how quickly northern society was reorganizing itself. Farmers, teachers, and laborers filled benches, each hoping that decades of struggle might finally give way to reforms they had once only whispered about. Soviet officers stood near the entrance, observing the discussions without intervening, their presence shaping the pace and direction even in silence. At the center of these meetings, a figure began to draw attention across the region. Kim Il-sung arrived in towns flanked by military escorts, yet spoke in a tone that appealed to villagers accustomed to hardship. He described plans to redistribute land taken by collaborators or large estate holders. He promised that a new national army would defend the peninsula's sovereignty rather than serve foreign ambitions. Many who listened saw in him a leader molded by years of resistance, someone capable of unifying the northern committees into something more structured. His influence expanded steadily as Soviet advisors supported his growing role, presenting him as a man prepared to guide the region toward a new order. Villagers who had never met him still spoke his name at shared meals or during rest breaks in the fields, recounting stories they had heard from traveling workers or printed leaflets. Some admired his confidence, others questioned whether any single figure should rise so quickly in a land emerging from occupation. But his message aligned closely with the priorities of the committees: land reform, social reorganization, and the construction of institutions loyal not to a distant capital, but to the people who had endured decades of forced labor, heavy taxation, and cultural suppression. Under his leadership, the Northern Zone's administration began to take clear shape. Meanwhile, whispers of new political alliances drifted southward. In cities under American occupation, newspapers announced that influential leaders were forming parties, claiming to represent different visions for the peninsula. Conservatives gathered behind figures with long experience in exile or religious leadership. Moderates argued for a broad coalition that would keep foreign ideologies at bay. Left-leaning activists returned from prisons or hiding places believing they could finally shape a national movement. Meetings spilled from packed halls into street corners and cafes, where heated arguments unfolded late into the night. Yet this burst of political energy faced obstacles. American officials observed these developments with skepticism, wary that some groups might align too closely with northern committees. Permits for rallies were granted inconsistently. Newspapers found articles delayed by censors who insisted on vetting material for security risks. Rumors spread that certain political factions had closer access to occupation authorities than others. In this environment, ideological competition intensified, not only between North and South, but within the Southern Zone itself. University students became particularly active during this period. They organized coalitions to demand immediate nationwide elections and the creation of a unified government representing all regions. Their marches wound through central districts, carrying banners painted hurriedly in dormitories. Professors sometimes joined them, giving speeches from makeshift platforms about constitutional rights, education reform, or economic reconstruction. These rallies attracted crowds far larger than anyone expected, revealing how deeply the desire for unity ran among ordinary citizens. Yet American commanders, wary of unrest, responded unevenly. Some demonstrations were allowed to proceed as long as they remained peaceful. Others were dispersed by police units still drawn from remnants of colonial-era forces. Scuffles erupted, arrests followed, and suspicions deepened. Activists who had once fought side by side against Japanese rule now accused each other of serving foreign agendas. The shared struggle that had united so many against the empire began to fracture under the competing pressures of occupation and ideology. As political disagreements simmered, international discussions about Korea's future stalled. Joint commissions meant to coordinate independence found themselves unable to agree on which political groups qualified as legitimate representatives. Northern delegates insisted on including any organization that opposed colonial rule, regardless of ideology. American officials dismissed some of these groups as tools of foreign influence. Meetings ended repeatedly without progress, and each failure widened the growing gulf between the two administrations. Across rural landscapes, people tried to navigate this shifting environment with pragmatism. Farmers in valleys near the dividing line watched the behavior of officials from both zones, weighing which side might provide more stable harvest seasons. Landless laborers wondered whether promised reforms in the north might inspire similar measures in the south. Merchants studied supply routes carefully. Those who misread a change in border policy risked losing entire shipments. Everyday survival required quick adaptation to decisions made by leaders whose priorities had little to do with the rhythms of planting and trade. The southern zone soon faced choices of its own. As political parties multiplied, disputes over leadership intensified. Some groups rallied behind Syngman Rhee, a man who had lived abroad for many years and spoken extensively about independence on the international stage. His supporters admired his relentless lobbying. His critics argued he had been away too long to understand present realities. Still, his name surfaced repeatedly in American conversations about stability and governance. People who favored strong central authority saw him as a figure capable of consolidating power quickly in uncertain times. Rhee moved through political circles with practiced skill. He met with religious leaders, rallied student groups, and cultivated ties with military officials who had served under the colonial regime. These connections made him a polarizing presence. Opponents accused him of drawing strength from conservative networks that had not borne the full weight of occupation-era suffering. Supporters countered that he alone possessed the international experience necessary to negotiate with powerful nations encircling the peninsula. His rise revealed how deeply foreign alignment already influenced southern politics. While parties competed for influence, everyday challenges mounted. Urban neighborhoods struggled with overcrowding as refugees streamed in from areas disrupted by border uncertainty. Markets in major cities buzzed with goods that changed price from hour to hour, driven by fluctuating regulations and uneven supplies. Shantytowns grew along riverbanks where people sought work unloading cargo or repairing infrastructure damaged during the war. Conversations in these districts seldom discussed ideology. They focused instead on how to obtain rice, how to find shelter, or whether security forces would disrupt street stalls without warning. Even in these difficult circumstances, many citizens refused to give up on the dream of a unified peninsula. Writers drafted manifestos calling for a nationwide assembly. Clerics hosted inter-regional dialogues, urging patience and cooperation. Former independence fighters traveled between towns delivering speeches, urging reconciliation before differences hardened beyond repair. Their efforts drew applause, but seldom translated into political leverage. The machinery of division, once set in motion, moved with a momentum that small groups could not easily counter. In the north, consolidation accelerated. Land reform proceeded quickly, reorganizing ownership patterns that had existed for centuries. Families who had worked, rented fields under colonial rule found themselves suddenly holding deeds to the soil they cultivated. Estate owners lost vast properties in a process that felt abrupt, sometimes harsh, and in many cases irreversible. New security units formed from factory workers and former guerrillas, patrolled roads as committees drafted plans for a national army. Administrative offices expanded their reach, tightening the links between local councils and emerging central leadership. Southern administrators watched these developments anxiously. American officials expressed concerns that reforms in the north could influence southern laborers and farmers, who were already frustrated by rising costs and uneven opportunities. Conservative factions warned that rapid northern changes threatened to destabilize the entire peninsula. Meanwhile, Workers in southern industrial neighborhoods whispered about the possibility of similar reforms, drawing the attention of police units determined to prevent political agitation. Suspicion in the South turned not only toward northern authorities, but toward neighbors viewed as ideologically unreliable. International actors reinforced these trajectories. Soviet representatives made clear that northern committees would be supported as long as they aligned with broader regional strategies. American authorities, facing pressure from legislators at home, pushed for elections in the southern zone, even without cooperation from the north. The idea of a unified, peninsula-wide vote that many Koreans had demanded seemed to recede further into the distance. What had started as an administrative division increasingly resembled a political border with its own logic and permanence. Families caught between these zones attempted desperate measures to reunite. Some crossed mountain ridges by night, braving patrols to reach relatives living only a few miles away, but now separated by military orders. Others sought travel permits that took months to process, or were simply denied without explanation. Letters carried across the line often disappeared. Stories spread of people vanishing during attempted crossings, deepening the atmosphere of fear. Each lost connection reinforced the sense that the peninsula was being reshaped by forces that cared little for the bonds between its people. Through all of this, Koreans continued to hold gatherings in living rooms and tea rooms, where hot metal kettles steamed between cups. These small circles discussed the possibility of compromise. Even when official channels remained frozen, elders recalled past eras, when unity held firm despite hardship. Young activists argued that new forms of cooperation might still be possible if leaders listened to public sentiment. For a moment, these conversations offered refuge from the widening divide, but external pressure weighed heavily on every effort to find common ground. In both zones, military authorities prioritized stability over negotiation, loyalty over experimentation. Policies hardened. Committees aligned themselves with northern leadership, while southern parties prepared for elections exclusionary by design. Rival visions solidified into institutional realities. What had begun as a temporary arrangement now anchored two political worlds. Each had leaders preparing national structures. Each had security forces loyal to different alliances, and each presented itself as the rightful center of Korean sovereignty. The dream of a single government remained alive in memory and aspiration. Yet the machinery of division advanced step by step, shaping a future that neither side had intended when liberation first arrived. Warm winds swept through southern cities in 1948, as tension lingered over streets filled with posters announcing the approaching vote. Merchants patched awnings above their shops and watched groups of campaigners move from corner to corner, their chants rising above the clatter of afternoon markets. Some residents welcomed the noise, believing it signaled an overdue step towards self-rule. Others listened with apprehension, remembering how often foreign powers had promised freedom only to impose new systems of control. Despite uncertainty, the upcoming election carried a weight few could ignore. In government buildings reclaimed after the end of colonial rule, American officials and newly appointed Korean administrators pored over agreements that laid out how authority would pass to local hands. Crates of documents, maps, and financial ledgers filled hallways where officers drafted plans for policing, transportation, and communications. South Korean staff, some returning from exile, others drawn from earlier municipal posts, worked to reconcile competing priorities. The public clamoring for autonomy, occupation, authorities demanding security, and political groups struggling for recognition. Every decision seemed to carry consequences that would echo beyond the coming months. Syngman Rhee's presence loomed large over the political landscape. Wherever he spoke, crowds gathered, some drawn by his record as a long-time advocate for independence abroad, others wary of his firm approach to dissent. His speeches blended warnings about northern aggression with appeals for unity under strong leadership. His supporters depicted him as the one figure capable of steering the country through instability, while critics questioned the centralization of power he seemed to embrace. Regardless of stance, few could ignore the momentum surrounding him. Campaign caravans wound through narrow streets adorned with colorful banners. Loudspeakers blared patriotic songs and speeches promising economic revival and restored dignity. Newspapers, sometimes thin from lack of ink and newsprint, devoted entire sections to debates between emerging parties. Students founded volunteer groups to encourage voter participation, distributing handwritten pamphlets explaining how ballots would be cast in tea houses. Arguments stretched late into the night as residents grappled with what independence should look like after decades of occupation. Yet this vibrant political scene existed alongside deeper fractures. Some activists refused to participate in an election confined to the southern zone, arguing that any government formed without northern participation betrayed the dream of a unified Korea. Demonstrations erupted in several cities, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. American military units monitored these gatherings closely, wary that disorder could be exploited by groups aligned with northern committees. Tensions simmered as the date of the vote drew near. Polling day arrived beneath bright skies. Lines formed outside schools and municipal buildings repurposed as voting stations. Families approached the booths with a mix of apprehension and quiet pride. Elderly residents who had never cast a ballot before walked slowly toward wooden tables staffed by volunteers. Younger voters moved quickly, eager to shape a future they believed belonged to their generation. Security officers patrolled the perimeters, their presence a reminder of the fragile order holding everything together. Once ballots were counted, the announcement of results spread rapidly. Rhee had secured the presidency, gaining broad support from rural communities, religious networks, and conservative organizations. Celebrations erupted in some districts as supporters lit paper lanterns and marched with drums. Other neighborhoods reacted with caution, believing the new administration might prioritize control over reconciliation. Regardless of differing opinions, everyone understood that the peninsula had crossed a threshold. For the first time in decades, a Korean-led government was in place in the South. Preparations for the transition of power moved quickly. American officials held ceremonies to formalize the transfer of authority, offering congratulations while making clear that their military presence would not vanish entirely. Banners reading "Republic of Korea" were hung across government complexes, where new ministers took their oaths of office. Civil servants, many of whom had served under colonial administrators, reviewed their roles and expected reforms. Offices buzzed with anxious anticipation as the new state began taking shape. Rhee's cabinet confronted immediate challenges. Ministries lacked trained personnel, capable of managing budgets, infrastructure, and diplomacy. Files inherited from the colonial era were incomplete or contradictory. Rail lines damaged by war required urgent repair. Ports had to be reorganized to handle cargo arriving from American supply chains. Officials moved between meetings with stacks of documents under their arms, attempting to draft policies while handling constant emergencies. The young republic needed time to build stable institutions, yet events unfolding to the north allowed little breathing room. A new national police force formed from various units trained by American advisors. Recruits drilled in open courtyards beside half-damaged buildings, learning procedures modeled on foreign systems. Senior officers emphasized loyalty to the Republic and vigilance against infiltration from northern agents. This focus reflected rising anxiety as reports emerged of border skirmishes and partisan activity in rural regions. Citizens living near the parallel woke at night to distant bursts of gunfire or patrol vehicles rushing along unlit roads. Fear crept into conversations, even as leaders urged calm. Construction of the South Korean army began with similar urgency. Former soldiers who had served under the Japanese were evaluated, retrained, and assigned to new units. Younger men volunteered in large numbers, driven by a mix of patriotism, financial need, and concern about northern intentions. Training camps established across southern provinces echoed with shouted commands, and the thudding of boots against dusty ground. Weapons shipments arrived at ports, though supplies remained limited. Military planners knew they were racing against time. Amid these security concerns, the government attempted to rebuild civilian life. Schools reopened with revised curricula, emphasizing national identity and civic responsibility. Volunteers helped repair damaged classrooms, collecting charcoal and scrap wood to heat buildings in the colder months. Teachers wrote new lessons late into the night, drawing inspiration from older texts that had survived confiscation during colonial rule. Students arrived each morning carrying notebooks wrapped in cloth sleeves, stitched by parents hoping to protect scarce supplies. Markets reflected the upheaval of the times. Merchants replenished stalls, with vegetables grown in reclaimed fields. Bundles of thread and fabric imported from American warehouses, and tools forged in local workshops revived after years of dormancy. Housewives haggled over soybean paste, dried fish, or coarse salt, while keeping an ear open for rumors about political developments. Prices shifted unpredictably as transportation disruptions or policy changes rippled across regions. Every purchase felt like a negotiation between hope and practicality. Urban neighborhoods continued to absorb families displaced by the war and the division. Makeshift shelters lined the edges of major cities. Built from scrap lumber and rusted corrugated metal, aid workers delivered rice sacks and blankets, offering temporary relief to those who had lost homes or fled northern committees. The new government debated long-term housing plans, but resources were scarce. Nevertheless, communities did what they could. Neighbors shared coal briquettes, women organized communal cooking circles, and children invented games in narrow alleys, where laughter occasionally cut through the tension of the times. Political pressure built steadily as Rhee consolidated authority. His administration emphasized the need for strong leadership to counter threats from the North newspapers, printed articles highlighting alleged infiltration attempts. Radio broadcasts repeated warnings about enemy agents. Opposition groups accused the government of exploiting fear to suppress dissent. Instances of censorship, arrests, and intimidation surfaced, fueling resentment among those who wanted a more inclusive political system. Public debate grew more polarized, with moderates struggling to find space between increasingly hardened positions. Despite internal strain, diplomatic engagements continued. Delegations from the Republic of Korea traveled to Washington, Manila, and other allied capitals to secure recognition and economic assistance. Foreign ministers returned with agreements to support reconstruction, though funds arrived more slowly than promised. Agricultural advisors introduced new techniques to increase rice yields. Engineers assisted with bridge repairs and irrigation systems. These partnerships offered small victories, but the Republic remained heavily reliant on foreign support during its earliest years. Conversations inside private homes reflected a mixture of pride and worry. Parents urged their children to study diligently, believing education would become the foundation of a stronger nation. Elders recounted earlier eras when unity had endured despite hardship, hoping to keep faith alive for a future that seemed perilously uncertain. Many families pinned calendars to their walls, circling dates representing upcoming policy announcements or military developments. Every piece of news carried weight, shaping moods and expectations as weeks turned into months. Tension along the dividing line grew harder to ignore. Patrols clashed over contested outposts. Farmers ploughing fields near the border spotted armed groups moving at dusk. Merchants traveling with goods risked detainment if caught crossing without authorization. These incidents fed speculation that confrontation might be inevitable. Southern officials reinforced outposts, extended communication lines, and urged residents to report suspicious activity. Fear seeped into daily routines. People walking alone at night often glanced over their shoulders, alert to sounds that might signal danger. Even with these clouds gathering, the Republic pressed forward with institution building. Civil service exams reopened, attracting candidates eager to join a government that promised to represent the people rather than a foreign empire. Courts reorganized according to new statutes blending local customs with imported legal principles. Religious organizations expanded their involvement in social welfare, founding orphanages, clinics, and literacy programs to support vulnerable communities. Each development added another thread to a national framework struggling to hold under intensifying pressure. Men and women who had endured war and occupation found themselves confronting a new reality. Independence had not guaranteed stability. The Republic stood between aspiration and threat, trying to define itself while bracing against turmoil from the north. Conversations across the peninsula repeated the same quiet acknowledgement. The future felt unpredictable, yet the country had no choice but to walk toward it, step by step. The South Korean state, fragile yet determined, was only beginning to understand how much would be demanded of it. Institutions had been outlined, leadership chosen, and foreign recognition secured. But the peninsula's unresolved division cast a long shadow. Every achievement carried the weight of a greater struggle, approaching from beyond the parallel, one that would soon test the very foundations now being laid in the Republic's formative years. Autumn haze settled over northern farmland in 1948, as word spread that a new state was formally taking shape. Villagers paused mid-harvest to listen to announcements broadcast from loudspeakers mounted on trucks that rolled slowly through dirt roads. The messages spoke of a government led by Koreans, organized to eliminate exploitation and rebuild the region on principles of equality and collective strength. The name Democratic People's Republic of Korea echoed through valleys that had witnessed decades of subjugation. And many residents felt a flicker of pride at hearing a Korean government declared without foreign oversight. Committees that had operated informally since liberation now stepped forward with clearer purpose. Their members walked through towns carrying notebooks filled with lists of households, land parcels, and factory inventories. Each committee served as the link between local communities and the emerging central authority headquartered in Pyongyang. Meetings grew longer and more structured. Speeches emphasized the urgency of forming a government capable of resisting imperial influence, rebuilding industry, and preventing the return of old elites who had benefited from colonial rule. In these gatherings, Kim Il-sung's influence continued to expand. He traveled tirelessly across the region, speaking in factories, schools, and rural assembly grounds. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared, listening as he described a future where land belonged to those who cultivated it, and production served the well-being of the entire population. His wartime experience fighting against imperial forces gave him authority in the eyes of many who had suffered under occupation. Soviet officers positioned him as the central figure, capable of uniting disparate factions into a cohesive state, but his growing support also reflected the expectations of people who wanted decisive leadership in uncertain times. As officials debated policy, land reform took shape as the first major undertaking of the new administration. Surveyors walked through paddies and orchards, marking boundaries and recording ownership histories. Families who had rented soil from landlords for generations watched as agents tallied acreage and issued new certificates that transferred control into the hands of those who worked it. While some large landowners protested or fled southward, most villages accepted the changes with a sense of overdue justice. The reform did not erase poverty, but it fundamentally altered relationships that had endured for centuries. Industrial areas received similar attention. Factories abandoned during Japan's surrender had been restarted with assistance from Soviet engineers, who inspected turbines, replaced damaged components, and reorganized work floors. Machines that had once operated for imperial extraction now produced goods for local consumption or internal trade. Workers returned to assembly lines under new supervisory committees that emphasized discipline, productivity, and ideological commitment. Walls were repainted with slogans celebrating reconstruction and collective progress. For laborers who had endured harsh conditions during occupation, these shifts carried the promise of a future defined by their own effort, rather than foreign demands. Security forces formed rapidly as well. Former guerrillas, volunteers from youth organizations, and workers from heavy industry joined new military units that would eventually become the Korean People's Army training grounds, sprouted on the outskirts of cities, where recruits marched under banners bearing messages of unity and vigilance. Instructors drilled formations from dawn until dusk, stressing the importance of defending the new republic against external threats. Rumors of growing instability along the southern border spread through training camps, fueling determination among recruits to prepare for any confrontation. Inside administrative buildings, a one-party structure took root. The Workers' Party of Korea consolidated influence by absorbing smaller organizations that had formed in the early days of liberation meetings of party cadres, reviewed ideological education programs, distribution policies, and local committee performance. Membership offered access to training, leadership roles, and pathways to influence, but also required strict loyalty. Policies were articulated with clarity and a sense of mission, reinforcing the belief that unity of purpose was essential for the survival of the fledgling state. As party structures strengthened, propaganda campaigns expanded to reach every corner of the northern zone. Posters appeared in village squares depicting farmers, miners, and soldiers contributing to national reconstruction. Radio broadcasts praised collective achievements and explained new policies in carefully crafted language. Schoolchildren practiced songs, extolling hard work and devotion to the Republic. While some embraced this messaging enthusiastically, others felt unease as personal opinions gave way to scripted narratives. Nevertheless, public participation evolved into a defining element of the national identity being constructed. Tension along the dividing line intensified the urgency of these efforts. Reports of confrontations between patrols circulated widely, accompanied by stories of northern activists being detained or killed in the south. Families living near the border lived with a heightened sense of danger. Parents warned children not to wander into hills where gunfire sometimes echoed at dusk. Traders attempting to cross with goods risked arrest or worse. These incidents fed the growing conviction that peaceful coexistence with the Southern administration might be unlikely. Despite rising hostilities, Northern leaders attempted diplomatic gestures. Committees proposed joint assemblies, cross-border economic initiatives, and cooperative measures to manage refugee flows. These proposals rarely advanced. Southern officials viewed them with suspicion, interpreting them as attempts to expand Northern influence. Meetings arranged through international intermediaries ended with polite statements that masked deeper mistrust. Each failure hardened attitudes on both sides and pushed the peninsula toward deeper division. Inside homes and communal halls, people discussed these developments in hushed tones. Elderly residents who had lived through previous political transitions wondered whether another conflict was approaching younger generations, shaped by years of hardship, expressed determination to defend the Republic regardless of the cost. Some families prepared emergency stores of rice and firewood in case fighting erupted. Others made plans to join paramilitary organizations that offered both protection and purpose. The atmosphere grew tense, yet also filled with a sense of collective resolve. Amid this political climate, cultural shifts unfolded in subtle ways. Art troupes formed to stage performances celebrating liberation and revolutionary struggle. Engineers and scientists were praised in newspapers as symbols of national pride, their work framed as essential to securing independence. Students learned history from textbooks rewritten to emphasize resistance against imperial domination and the importance of unity under strong leadership. Every aspect of cultural life was woven into the narrative that the new state embodied the will and future of the Korean people. Government planners also confronted practical challenges. Damaged infrastructure had to be repaired, transportation networks reconnected, and communication systems rebuilt. Engineers inspected bridges weakened by neglect during wartime. Road crews expanded routes linking remote villages to industrial centers. Electrical plants restored partial supply to cities where blackouts had become routine. Each improvement represented progress towards stability, but shortages of materials slowed development. Even so, the determination to rebuild gave direction to communities hungry for normalcy. Contacts with the Soviet Union deepened during this period. Technical advisors assisted with mining operations, steel production, and military training. Shipments of machinery and grain arrived through northern ports, stabilizing the economy during early reconstruction. These exchanges strengthened ties between the two governments, while reinforcing fears in the south that the northern zone was aligning too closely with foreign ideology. Yet for many residents, the assistance provided tangible relief. Electrified neighborhoods, restored irrigation systems, and new workshops capable of producing essential tools. Internal consolidation continued as the new state prepared for long-term governance. Party committees established literacy campaigns to reach rural populations that had received limited schooling under colonial rule. Health clinics expanded vaccination drives and medical outreach. Agricultural specialists introduced crop rotation methods intended to increase yields in regions where soil depletion posed growing risks. Each initiative demonstrated the Republic's ambition to control not only political structures, but the daily lives of its citizens. Still, not everyone adapted easily. Individuals labeled as collaborators or ideological adversaries faced surveillance or re-education. Some disappeared into detention centers where relatives rarely obtained information. The growing machinery of control, police units, neighborhood watch groups, and party monitors inserted itself into conversations, workplaces, and community gatherings. Compliance became not just expected, but essential for survival. A sense of caution settled over interactions, even among friends who once spoke freely. Meanwhile, Pyongyang transformed rapidly. Government buildings rose along newly paved streets where workers planted rows of young trees. Banners celebrating the Republic fluttered from rooftops. Construction crews expanded housing districts to accommodate officials arriving from smaller towns to take up administrative posts. The steady hum of rebuilding activity signaled the capital's emergence as the center of northern political life. Amid this development, statues and memorials appeared, honoring figures who symbolized the spirit of resistance mobilized by the government. In the countryside, farmers adapted to new expectations. Crop quotas increased as planners sought to supply growing urban populations. Cooperative systems encouraged families to share equipment, seeds, and labor. Some welcomed the assistance, others felt strained by demands that outpaced their abilities. Yet support from the state, fertilizer shipments, new irrigation pumps, and training visits from agricultural instructors helped maintain a sense of direction even when workloads intensified. By late 1948, the new republic projected an image of unity and purpose. The leadership presented itself as the rightful embodiment of Korean sovereignty, promising to defend the peninsula from foreign aggression and build an egalitarian future through collective effort. Institutions had been established, borders secured, and ideological foundations laid. Yet beneath the rhetoric of certainty, tension simmered. The division across the parallel deepened daily. Patrols clashed, political claims escalated, and both governments asserted legitimacy over the entire peninsula. Within northern homes, conversations reflected this duality. Pride in the Republic's achievements mixed with anxiety about what conflict might bring. Parents reminded children to study hard so they could contribute to national development. Neighbors shared goods and helped mend roofs damaged by storms, reinforcing social bonds that had endured war and reconstruction. Though residents rarely expressed doubts publicly, most understood that a larger confrontation was slowly building, shaped by forces far beyond their villages and city streets. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, still young and confident, saw itself standing at the threshold of a decisive era. A sense of revolutionary resolve filled its institutions. Yet the peninsula remained divided, each side claiming the same homeland, the same history, and the same right to lead Korea's future. That unresolved struggle would soon push the region into a conflict whose scale neither government fully anticipated. Summer settled heavily over the peninsula in June 1950, pressing down on fields, dirt roads, and quiet villages along the dividing line. Farmers rose before dawn to reach their paddies, unaware that troops hidden beyond nearby ridges were preparing for an assault that would shatter the uneasy calm holding the two Koreas apart. Patrols along the parallel noticed small irregularities, lights flickering at unusual hours, supply carts creaking through forest paths, unfamiliar voices drifting across ravines. But no one predicted how swiftly the storm would break. The first cannon blast tore through the early morning air, like a warning from another world. It was followed by a rolling thunder of artillery that shook windows miles away. Families rushed from their homes, confused and terrified as smoke rose in dark columns from border posts. Northern troops surged forward in well-coordinated formations, their advance supported by tanks crawling over rugged terrain. They moved with confidence born from months of preparation, overwhelming outnumbered southern units that struggled to organize a defense. Radio transmissions filled with scattered reports. Commanders in the Republic of Korea's army scrambled to gather information from collapsing outposts. Officers shouted orders through static-filled channels, trying to determine which roads were still open, which bridges remained intact, and which units could be rallied. The speed of the assault stunned them. Soldiers who had been patrolling quiet sectors the day before now fought desperately to hold towns where streets echoed with rifle fire and the roar of armored vehicles. Civilians living near the border faced the shock firsthand. Families abandoned homes with little more than a small bag tied with string, grabbing children by the wrists as they fled toward the south. Livestock wandered through empty courtyards. Wells stood uncovered. Schools that had begun teaching new curricula just months earlier emptied in moments. Refugees streamed down main roads, some pushing carts stacked with blankets and rice sacks, others carrying infants wrapped hastily in cloth. They followed whichever path seemed least threatened, their steps driven more by instinct than direction. Military trucks raced past them heading north, engines straining under the weight of soldiers trying to reach defensive lines before they collapsed entirely. Some units positioned between towns put up fierce resistance, slowing the advance long enough for civilians to escape. Yet ammunition ran low, communications faltered, and reinforcements arrived too slowly. Rumors spread of northern columns approaching faster than anyone believed possible. Panic grew as residents heard the distant churn of engines and the rattle of machine guns. Inside Seoul, government ministries entered a whirlwind of activity. Officials gathered in chambers still cluttered with paperwork from ongoing reconstruction efforts. Maps stretched across long tables showed red markers pushing rapidly toward the capital. Advisors debated evacuation plans, while runners carried messages between buildings. Some urged immediate withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Others insisted on defending the city at all costs. President Ri addressed his cabinet with urgency, stressing the need to mobilize every available resource while contacting international allies for assistance. As the northern advance intensified, roads leading to Seoul clogged with refugees. Streams of people crossed bridges spanning the Hangang River, clutching bundles of belongings as trucks and military vehicles squeezed through gaps in the crowd. The atmosphere grew chaotic. Mothers called out for missing children. Men carried elders on their backs. Soldiers shouted instructions that few could hear over the din. Nightfall brought little relief. Fires burned along hillsides where villages had been struck, casting long shadows across the river. Military planners attempted to establish defensive perimeters around the capital, positioning artillery on ridges and setting up machine gun nests at key intersections. Young recruits, some barely trained, dug trenches with trembling hands, while officers reassured them that reinforcements were on their way. Yet the tide of the assault proved relentless. Northern armored units pushed through weak points in the line, bypassing pockets of resistance and cutting communication cables. When enemy columns reached the outskirts of Seoul, the defenders understood the city could not be held. Evacuation became the only option. Government officials boarded vehicles heading south, leaving behind stacks of documents and equipment too cumbersome to transport. Loudspeakers announced that civilians should prepare to relocate, but many had no means to travel farther, or no desire to abandon homes already rebuilt after earlier hardships. Bridges groaned under the weight of thousands streaming across them, each step carrying people farther from familiar neighborhoods and deeper into uncertainty. When northern troops finally entered the city, they encountered streets littered with debris, overturned carts, and abandoned furniture. Residents who had remained hid behind shuttered windows as columns marched past, their boots echoing between stone walls. Some watched silently, resigned to the belief that the shift in control was unavoidable. Others trembled, fearing retribution or forced conscription. Soldiers raised their flags atop administrative buildings, signaling that the capital had fallen under their authority. South of the city, retreating units attempted to form new defensive lines. Officers placed artillery along hillsides overlooking narrow valleys, hoping the terrain would slow the enemy's advance. Exhausted soldiers stumbled into position, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat. Some had lost contact with their original units and joined whichever formation they encountered. Despite fatigue, determination held. The Republic had suffered a staggering blow, yet its forces were not ready to surrender the peninsula. Government convoys pushed farther south toward Dijon and Daegu, regrouping in administrative centers where officials coordinated relief for the growing wave of displaced people. Train stations overflowed with families seeking transport, though rail lines were frequently cut by advancing troops. Churches, schools, and public halls became makeshift shelters. Volunteers prepared porridge in large pots to feed the hungry. Aid workers recorded names of missing relatives and tried to match them with lists arriving from other districts. Meanwhile, the northern advance continued past the capital, seizing towns along major highways and pushing towards strategic ports. The speed of the operation left southern commanders scrambling to re-establish control. Bridges were destroyed to delay armored movement. Roadblocks sprang up where soldiers hoped to channel enemy forces into narrow passes. Yet these efforts only slowed, not stopped, the progress of the Northern Army. By late June, the Republic of Korea's government sent urgent appeals to allied nations, warning that the entire peninsula could fall if support did not arrive quickly. Messages reached foreign capitals describing the dire situation. Southern units were outmatched in equipment, outmaneuvered in the field, and overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of the northern campaign. Without reinforcements, the Republic risked collapse. International attention turned sharply toward Korea. Debate ignited in diplomatic chambers as representatives weighed the consequences of intervention. Military advisors analyzed reports of casualties and enemy positions. Newspapers abroad ran headlines describing the swift advance and the humanitarian crisis unfolding as millions fled southward. The global conflict that had defined the previous decade was barely over, yet the world was being pulled into another confrontation. While foreign governments deliberated, the southern military attempted one last major effort to halt the northern push. Units concentrated along the approaches to Daejeon, using the city's layout to create defensive choke points. Barricades rose overnight from sandbags and overturned vehicles. Artillery teams dug into the hills overlooking the main road. Reinforcements from farther provinces arrived carrying rifles still smelling of fresh oil. Civilians assisted by bringing water, blankets, and rice balls to soldiers, preparing for what many expected to be a decisive battle. Fighting erupted with ferocity. Explosions rattled tiled roofs, sending fragments of clay into the streets below. Flames leapt from warehouses struck by shells. Medical stations set up in schoolhouses filled rapidly with wounded soldiers and injured civilians. Yet despite their efforts, defenders gradually lost ground. Northern infantry advanced in waves, supported by vehicles that crushed barricades and forced southern units to withdraw street by street. News of the defeat spread quickly. Refugees gathered outside the city, heard the distant rumble of tanks, and knew they had to move again. Families that had just settled temporarily now packed up what little they still carried. Many no longer had strength to hope for stability. Survival became their only goal. Once more, roads filled with people moving south, forming long, dust-covered lines stretching beyond the horizon. As July approached, the geometry of the war changed. The northern advance had carried its forces deep into the heart of the peninsula, pushing the Republic to the brink. Yet this momentum soon drew a global response. Ships loaded with foreign troops prepared to depart, aircraft fueled for distant missions, and plans formed to assist the collapsing southern front. The battle for Korea was no longer a local conflict. It had become a crucible for competing visions of the post-war world. The early phase of the invasion had redrawn the map with alarming speed. Cities fell, communities scattered, and the young republic struggled to remain standing. Troops regrouped near southern ports, families huddled in shelters with no certainty about tomorrow, and officials waited anxiously for the outcome of foreign deliberations. A storm unleashed at dawn had transformed the peninsula within weeks, and the next stage of the conflict was beginning to stir beyond its shores. Smoke drifted above ridgelines as columns of foreign troops disembarked at southern ports, stepping onto ground they had last seen during wartime a few years earlier. Their arrival drew crowds who watched silently from a distance, unsure whether to feel relief or apprehension. Military trucks rumbled inland within hours, passing long lines of displaced families who paused only to glance at the unfamiliar uniforms. The war had become international, and that reality settled on the peninsula with undeniable force. Commanders from the newly arrived multinational force convened inside hastily converted offices. Maps covered nearly every wall, pinned with colored markers that tracked the rapid northern advance. Officers studied possible landing sites for reinforcements, identified strategic bridges, and evaluated the fragile state of the Republic of Korea's remaining defensive positions. Every conversation was urgent. They understood that the southern government now held only a fraction of the peninsula, and that without swift action, there might no longer be a country to defend. Orders spread quickly through the ranks. Units embarked on operations to push toward critical junctions that had fallen early in the conflict. Artillery batteries rolled into position as engineers reinforced roads damaged by retreating forces. Pilots prepared for missions intended to slow the enemy's momentum. Coordination across languages and command structures proved challenging, yet necessity forced cooperation with remarkable speed. As foreign troops advanced northward, southern soldiers, already entrenched near Busan, watched them arrive with a mixture of exhaustion and renewed determination. Many had fought continuously since the outbreak of the war, losing comrades, ground, and supplies in the process. Seeing new battalions march in with confidence rekindled morale that had nearly collapsed under the weight of retreat. Civilians sheltering in nearby hillsides whispered that perhaps the Republic had one final chance. The first coordinated counterattack unfolded along a stretch of coastline where northern supply lines had extended dangerously thin. Tanks moved across muddy fields, infantry fanned out among scattered farmhouses, and artillery thundered from concealed positions. Northern soldiers, accustomed to rapid gains, found themselves facing opponents with superior firepower and air support. Bombers roared overhead, targeting convoys that had pushed too far south without reinforcement. For the first time since the war began, the advance slowed noticeably. Success bred confidence. Commanders expanded the offensive, striking toward communication hubs that connected the Northern Army's southernmost units with those positioned closer to the border. Battles erupted in towns that had already changed hands more than once. Streets filled with shattered stone and spent casings, as groups of soldiers fought house to house. Civilians hiding in school basements listened to the thunder of explosions and prayed that the fighting would pass quickly. Even victory in such places came at tremendous human cost. Reports of progress spread through refugee camps and temporary shelters. People clung to stories of recaptured villages and isolated northern units forced to withdraw. Some families began asking if they might soon return home, though few dared to believe it fully. War had already taught them that the front could shift in a single day, erasing any sense of stability. As the counteroffensive accelerated, commanders set their sights on a bold operation behind enemy lines. Troops loaded into amphibious craft under the cover of darkness, aware that the fate of the entire campaign depended on the mission's success. When these units landed near a strategic western port, northern authorities were caught off guard. The maneuver divided their forces abruptly, disrupting supply routes and communications. For the first time, northern commanders found themselves unprepared for the speed and precision of the enemy's movements. Confusion rippled through the northern ranks. Units south of the landing zone faced isolation as roads became impassable or were seized by multinational troops. Orders issued from headquarters conflicted with the chaos unfolding on the ground. Soldiers, accustomed to advancing, now had to retreat through unfamiliar terrain, often under heavy fire. Captured equipment, abandoned vehicles, and stacks of hastily discarded supplies revealed the scale of the disruption. The southern capital, long lost in the initial assault, became a target for liberation. Urban combat erupted as multinational and southern forces pushed into city districts where northern troops had dug in. Windows shattered under machine gun bursts, barricades smoldered, and artillery carved new scars across streets already damaged from earlier battles. Residents peered nervously from cellars or evacuation centers, waiting for any sign that the tide had turned. When the city finally changed hands again, crowds emerged cautiously, waving makeshift flags and greeting soldiers with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Meanwhile, northern leaders convened emergency sessions to assess the deteriorating situation. Kim Il-sung and his senior commanders studied reports detailing lost ground and mounting casualties. Their rapid victories had lulled them into confidence, but now they recognized the threat posed by better-equipped foreign forces. Discussions pivoted toward how to stabilize the front and prevent a catastrophic collapse that could push the war all the way back to their core strongholds. As multinational and southern troops pressed north of the capital, they encountered fierce resistance. Northern soldiers erected defensive positions along ravines, ridgelines, and river crossings. Mines were buried beneath dirt roads. Snipers waited behind broken walls. Any building capable of offering cover became a potential fortress. Though retreat had been forced upon them, northern units fought with determination, slowing the advance whenever possible. The war front expanded rapidly. Battles erupted simultaneously across mountain passes, coastal plains, and industrial corridors. Civilians caught between advancing and retreating forces faced harrowing choices. Some fled into forests carrying only what they could hold. Others attempted to reach relatives farther north, unsure whether the roads ahead remained safe. Aid workers struggled to direct waves of displaced people towards shelters that were already overcrowded. Foreign advisors in southern command centers urged a continued push. They argued that recapturing the entire peninsula would guarantee long-term stability and prevent future conflict. Southern officials, emboldened by recent gains, agreed. Plans were drafted for a drive toward the northern capital. Soldiers marched past cheering crowds in recaptured towns, unaware of the scale of resistance awaiting them farther ahead. Crossing the parallel ignited a new phase of the war. Troops moving into the northern zone encountered terrain that favored defenders. Rugged hills forced columns into narrow channels, where ambushes proved devastating. Winter equipment had not yet arrived, and cold winds bit through thin uniforms as soldiers climbed steep inclines under enemy fire. Meanwhile, Civilians in northern villages watched anxiously as foreign and southern forces approached, unsure whether to flee or hope the front would pass quickly. Northern leadership sought assistance from its powerful neighbor. Requests for support emphasized the threat posed by foreign troops nearing the border. Diplomatic messages described the risk of hostile forces standing only a short distance from northern mountains. These appeals resonated in government halls across the border, where leaders feared encirclement and instability spreading to their own frontiers. Trucks and trains began transporting supplies to assist the northern war effort. Advisors crossed into command posts to study battle plans and provide guidance. Still, the multinational force continued to push onward, capturing towns with symbolic and strategic importance. Newspapers abroad printed confident headlines predicting an imminent end to the war. That optimism shattered with the arrival of new forces entering from the northwest. Columns of troops wearing unfamiliar uniforms moved swiftly through mountain passes. Their presence caught multinational and southern units off guard. Early encounters were limited, probing actions that revealed little of their overall strength. But once major engagements erupted, the scale of this intervention became unmistakable. Battles flared along river valleys, where foreign units surged forward with unexpected precision. Multinational forces, already stretched thin from extended supply lines, struggled to adapt tanks bogged down in icy terrain. Communication wires snapped under artillery fire. Patrols reported enemy troop concentrations far larger than anticipated. Confusion spread through southern and foreign ranks as they tried to determine how deeply these new forces intended to push. Retreats began that night. Officers ordered units back to more defensible positions, hoping to reorganize before the next wave of attacks. Soldiers scrambled over rocky slopes as flares lit the sky and gunfire echoed across frozen ground. Exhaustion weighed heavily on every step. Urban centers that had been captured only weeks earlier now fell again under overwhelming pressure. Civilian populations fled in multiple directions. Families who had remained in northern towns packed what they could into bundles and followed old footpaths toward caves or ravines where they might shelter temporarily. Villagers farther south, who had just returned to their homes, now faced evacuation once more. The constant shift of the front created a sense of disorientation that left people unsure where safety existed. As multinational and southern forces fell back across the parallel, commanding officers recognized that the war had entered a brutal equilibrium. Neither side could easily break. Territories changed hands repeatedly. Hills surrendered in one assault were recaptured days later. Trenches carved into frozen soil became battlegrounds that consumed countless lives. Soldiers endured long stretches of stalemate, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. Tactics adapted to this new phase. Communication trenches connected front-line positions. Artillery units targeted opposing hillsides with precise calculations, turning the landscape into uneven ground marked by deep craters. Front-line soldiers rotated regularly to avoid collapse from exhaustion. Medical teams worked tirelessly to treat injuries in canvas tents, constantly threatened by incoming fire. Negotiations for a ceasefire began tentatively. Envoys from various nations proposed preliminary frameworks for halting the fighting. Meetings occurred at neutral villages, where representatives sat at long tables beneath dim lanterns, exchanging proposals that shifted from day to day. Progress was slow. Each side demanded concessions the other refused to grant, yet none could ignore the mounting toll of continued warfare. Voices from the trenches conveyed the harsh reality. Letters written by soldiers and passed through improvised channels described the grinding stalemate. Mud that swallowed boots, nights filled with distant shelling, and the uncertainty of whether any assault would bring meaningful change. Civilians living near the front lines faced constant displacement, their homes repeatedly damaged or destroyed as each side fought for ground measured in meters. As months passed, the conflict settled into a pattern, resembling a vast, bitter tug of war. Neither army could achieve decisive victory, yet neither was willing to accept defeat. Diplomats, generals, and political leaders all understood that the war had reached a point where continued offensives brought diminishing returns. The peninsula had become a battleground locked in place, each side entrenched behind fortified positions stretching from coast to coast. The fierce momentum that marked the outbreak of war had dissipated. In its place remained a grinding struggle that consumed resources, lives, and hopes for swift resolution. Korea's landscape bore the scars of shifting fronts. Its people carried the weight of uncertainty, and its armies braced for what negotiations or renewed offensives might bring. The stalemate had begun, not by choice, but by the combined exhaustion and determination of forces unwilling to yield. When the guns finally fell quiet along the armistice line, a heavy stillness settled over the southern provinces. Villages that had changed hands multiple times stood dotted with collapsed roofs, shattered windows, and fields pitted by explosions. Families returned cautiously, stepping around debris to search for what remained of their homes. Some discovered little more than the stone foundations where kitchens once stood. Others found household items buried beneath layers of ash and soil. Each discovery reminded them that survival would now depend on rebuilding nearly everything from the ground up. Government officials toured the damage in open jeeps, confronting the staggering scale of the task ahead. Roads connecting key towns had been torn apart by tanks, and artillery bridges lay twisted in riverbeds. Schools reduced to skeletal frames no longer echoed with children's voices. Entire districts had been depopulated, their residents scattered across temporary shelters. Administrators took hurried notes, knowing that the Republic lacked the resources to tackle all problems at once. Priorities shifted daily as reports arrived, describing outbreaks of disease, shortages of clean water, and repeated flare-ups of unrest among displaced communities. Political tension grew quickly in this fragile environment. Past grievances resurfaced as factions competed to shape the Republic's future. Some demanded accountability for decisions made during the chaos of wartime retreats. Others argued that unity mattered more than retribution. Rhee's government, wary of internal opposition, tightened control over the press, investigated political rivals, and expanded the role of security agencies. Each arrest or interrogation stirred debate, fueling concerns that authoritarian tendencies were taking root beneath the banner of national stability. Yet the population's daily reality remained more immediate, securing food, shelter, and work. Volunteers organized public kitchens in ruined neighborhoods, where women stirred large pots of porridge over makeshift stoves. Men scavenged timber to build temporary walls and roofs. Aid shipments arrived sporadically at port cities, bringing crates of medical supplies, sacks of rice, and bundles of blankets. Distribution often depended on local networks, church congregations, neighborhood committees, and student volunteers, who coordinated efforts the government could not fully manage. As communities worked to survive, industrial districts began humming again. Engineers inspected factories damaged during air raids, replacing gears and welding collapsed beams so machinery could run once more. Foundries poured metal for tools, rail parts, and construction materials. Textile mills restarted on shortened schedules, their workers stitching uniforms, blankets, and clothing needed across the country. Each revived workshop became a beacon of progress. Even modest output signaled that the Republic might eventually regain economic footing. Rhee's administration attempted to channel this momentum into broader reconstruction. Advisors drafted economic plans centered on reviving agricultural production, restoring transportation networks, and expanding basic industries. Experts from abroad offered guidance on irrigation, crop rotation, and fertilizer use to replenish farmland devastated by war. Farmers attended training sessions held in fields still scarred by trenches, learning how to cultivate higher yield varieties of rice and barley. These efforts aimed to curb food shortages and reduce dependence on foreign aid. Urban centers also underwent significant change. Streets once filled with rubble were cleared by teams of laborers who carted debris to designated dumping grounds outside the city. Construction sites sprang up where apartment buildings had collapsed. Workers poured concrete foundations for new schools, hospitals, and public offices. Young men hammered nails into fresh wooden frames, while women carried bricks, sand, and mortar alongside them. The noise of rebuilding merged with the chatter of street vendors returning to reopen markets. Still, political instability cast a long shadow. Opposition leaders criticized the government for failing to address corruption, inflation, and uneven distribution of relief. Newspapers faced pressure to align with official messaging, and those that resisted found themselves facing investigations. Student groups organized rallies demanding political reform, sometimes clashing with police in tense standoffs near university gates. These confrontations revealed a deepening divide between a population yearning for democratic participation and an administration determined to maintain control. Foreign allies played a decisive role during this period. American advisors worked closely with ministries overseeing defense, finance, and agriculture. Loans and grants flowed into the Republic with the expectation that they would help create a stable, anti-communist state in the region. Development funds financed power stations, highways, and the import of machinery. American military presence remained strong, serving as both reassurance and reminder that the conflict had not been resolved, only frozen at the line marked by the armistice. As Reza Osses arrived, attention shifted toward education. Schools reopened in repaired buildings or temporary classrooms built from salvaged materials. Teachers who had survived the war returned to their posts, determined to raise a generation that would stabilize the Republic. Children learned to write on chalkboards made from repurposed wooden planks. Lessons emphasized civic duty, national recovery, and the sacrifices made during the war. Education became one of the few avenues through which families could imagine a brighter future. Economic life grew slowly but persistently. Markets expanded as traders brought fish from coastal towns, vegetables from inland farms, and imported goods arriving from foreign ports. Seoul, still bearing deep scars from repeated battles, transformed block by block as entrepreneurs repaired storefronts, opened workshops, and established new businesses. Judges returned to courtrooms that had been used as shelters during the war. Civil servants organized files in ministries that had once served as military headquarters. Governance, though imperfect, resumed its structure. Shift after shift, optimism mingled with hardship. Rhee's government pushed for industrialization despite limited resources, believing that economic strength would cement the Republic's legitimacy. Small factories received government loans to increase production. Training programs taught workers to operate modern equipment and adopt efficient methods. Rural cooperatives sought to improve rice yields by sharing tools and pooling labor. These efforts marked the beginning of a long transition toward economic modernization. Yet friction persisted beneath the surface. The government's reliance on strict security measures alienated many who had fought for independence and expected greater political openness. Stories of detainees held without trial circulated quietly. Families whispered about neighbors who had disappeared following accusations of disloyalty. Although some measures were justified as necessary for national security, they contributed to an atmosphere of fear and resignation. Meanwhile, survivors carried the emotional weight of war. Veterans walked through towns with visible injuries, supported by relatives who guided them over uneven ground. Widows petitioned local offices for assistance while raising children alone. Orphans roamed marketplaces seeking odd jobs to afford their next meal. Relief workers did what they could, but the needs of millions stretched far beyond any single agency's capacity. The Republic was rebuilding its institutions, but its people faced an equally demanding process of healing. Still, moments of resilience shone through. A teacher reopening a school with only half its roof intact, gathered students under a large tarpaulin, and resumed lessons. Shopkeepers bartered goods directly when cash was scarce, establishing informal networks that kept neighborhoods functioning. Farmers exchanged tools and shared seeds to ensure that harvests continued. Each of these acts, small on their own, contributed to a collective sense that the country might endure. Diplomatic recognition extended steadily during these years. Delegations from Asia, Europe, and the Americas visited the Republic, offering support or forging agreements. These visits elevated the nation's standing abroad and strengthened ties that would later shape its diplomatic posture. They also reinforced the belief that South Korea's survival mattered far beyond its borders, adding another layer of pressure to maintain stability. By the mid-1950s, visible transformation had begun to take hold. Rebuilt neighborhoods formed orderly grids where ruins had once dominated the skyline. Trains resumed service along restored lines. Farmers harvested crops from revitalized fields. Small factories expanded shifts to meet growing demand. The Republic still struggled with poverty, corruption, and political tension, but the groundwork of reconstruction had taken hold with unmistakable persistence. Residents who walked through newly repaired streets could finally imagine a future shaped not only by the aftermath of war, but by the promise of growth. Conversations in tea shops revolved around aspirations as much as grievances. Parents discussed their children's studies. Merchants weighed the possibility of expanding their businesses. Despite lingering uncertainty, many believed the Republic had survived its darkest hour. South Korea entered the next decade, carrying both the wounds of conflict and the momentum of a society determined to rebuild. The challenges ahead would be immense: political reforms, economic development, and social transformation. But the nation had begun moving in a direction that no invading army or collapsed building could easily reverse. Ruined industrial towns north of the armistice line filled quickly with movement once the shooting stopped. Smoke no longer rose from burning warehouses, but cranes, trucks, and work crews soon took their place. Rival forces had withdrawn to their respective zones, leaving behind scorched factories, damaged rail yards, and villages emptied by months of fighting. Northern officials surveyed these landscapes with clipboards in hand, noting which facilities could be revived immediately and which required full reconstruction. Their instructions spread rapidly through local committees, setting reconstruction into motion before homes had even cooled from the fires of war. Teams of workers returned to mines that had supplied coal and metals to the region before the conflict. Machinery, some salvaged, some imported, was installed under the supervision of engineers dispatched from Pyongyang miners descended shafts with tools slung over their shoulders, determined to restore production in areas where the war had disrupted nearly every aspect of daily life. Upgraded pumps pushed water from flooded tunnels, while rail workers repaired tracks so it could be transported to recovering smelters. In many places, the sound of drills and engines became the backdrop of life long before schools or markets reopened. Farm communities faced a different challenge. Battle lines had cut through fertile plains, leaving fields pocked with craters and irrigation ditches filled with debris. Farmers gathered along riverbanks where officials explained new agricultural requirements. Cooperative systems expanded quickly, assigning families to shared work units responsible for clearing unexploded shells, restoring irrigation channels, and replanting essential crops. Additional hands, teachers, clerks, and students were drafted into these efforts, their presence marking a shift toward collective responsibility that reached far beyond traditional farming households. As villages stabilized, attention shifted to securing the boundaries of the new state. Military units reorganized into more structured formations, with command posts set up in reinforced buildings. Recruits trained on parade grounds carved from flattened fields, learning tactics shaped by both wartime experience and guidance from foreign advisors. Weapon stockpiles were replenished, communication lines extended, and observation posts reinforced along hills facing the south. Soldiers rotated through these posts in strict schedules, adapting to routines that blended discipline with constant vigilance. Political consolidation advanced just as rapidly. The Workers' Party tightened its organizational structure, standardizing meeting procedures across every province. Local cadres held regular sessions to report progress, distribute instructions, and evaluate whether communities adhered to the central plan. Committees inspected workplaces to ensure that productivity targets aligned with national development goals. Failures were addressed with stern warnings. Successes received public recognition that reinforced the party's authority and promoted loyalty. Kim Il-sung's leadership grew more prominent throughout this process. His visits to mining sites, collective farms, and factories were broadcast through speakers mounted on utility poles. These speeches praised people's efforts while urging them to work harder, rebuild faster, and remain united against external threats. Portraits of Kim appeared in public buildings, schools, and offices, often displayed beside banners bearing slogans that framed reconstruction as a patriotic duty. Residents who gathered to hear his announcements understood that the future of the Republic would unfold according to the centralized vision he articulated. The emphasis on heavy industry defined much of the state's strategy. Steel plants received priority shipments of fuel and spare parts, ensuring that they resumed production at pre-war levels as quickly as possible. Chemical facilities, essential for fertilizer and munitions, expanded under new management appointed directly by the central government. Electric grids were reconnected with the assistance of engineers trained abroad. Hydroelectric stations, some damaged, others untouched, pumped power into cities where lights had been dark for months. Economic planners published ambitious targets that circulated through schools and workplaces. Charts displayed in factories illustrated monthly goals, comparing actual output to projections that often edged upward with each new directive. Workers learned to track progress using color-coded boards hung near entrances. These displays reinforced a competitive spirit among work teams, motivating them to exceed quotas as a point of collective pride. Even children participated in small ways, gathering scrap metal for recycling drives encouraged by teachers. Cultural institutions adapted to the new order as well. Theatre troupes staged performances dramatizing the struggle for liberation and the sacrifices made during the war. Films produced in government studios portrayed heroic soldiers and diligent workers building a self-reliant society. School textbooks rewrote history to emphasize resilience and the importance of following the party's guidance. Music filled public squares during holidays, carried by orchestras that performed stirring compositions celebrating national unity. Propaganda teams operated alongside construction crews. They traveled in vans painted with bright colors, setting up portable stages in marketplaces and town centers. Actors performed short plays explaining new policies, while announcers read messages about agricultural reforms, industrial targets, and expected behavior of model citizens. These performances attracted large audiences, partly because they offered entertainment in places where leisure activities had become rare, and partly because participation signaled loyalty that residents felt compelled to display. Even as Reconstruction advanced, surveillance deepened. Neighborhood watch units kept close track of newcomers and monitored families considered politically unreliable. House inspections became routine, ensuring that propaganda materials were properly displayed and that meetings held by local cadres were attended regularly. People learned to navigate these expectations carefully. Conversations in public spaces shifted towards safe topics, production goals, community events, and school achievements, while private doubts, if they existed, were rarely spoken aloud. Foreign assistance supported this consolidation. Advisors from the Soviet Union offered training in engineering, chemistry, and military tactics. Shipments of industrial equipment arrived regularly through northern ports, helping to stabilize production. During the Republic's early years, grain deliveries reduced the threat of famine during difficult harvest seasons. These contributions reinforced political ties, while also granting Kim's government the resources needed to maintain momentum during Reconstruction. Contact with China also grew during this period. Chinese commanders who had served alongside Northern forces during the war occasionally visited the peninsula to advise on fortification efforts. Trade agreements were arranged to exchange mineral resources for food and manufactured goods. Students selected for exceptional performance were sent to Chinese universities to study engineering, medicine, or political science, returning later to take positions in government or industry. Such exchanges underscored the Republic's place within a broader network of socialist states. Despite strict control, pockets of hardship persisted. Regions far from industrial centers struggled with shortages of tools, fertilizer, and transportation. Families in mountainous areas faced difficulty receiving supplies during harsh weather, relying on local committees to ration food. Some communities rebuilt homes from the remnants of bombed-out buildings, patching walls with mud and salvaged bricks. Even well-organized distribution networks could not fully erase the devastation left by years of conflict. Still, progress seemed undeniable to many residents. Streets in Pyongyang filled with workers heading to jobs in newly opened factories. Teachers resumed classes in buildings repaired by volunteer labor. Cooperative farms harvested improved yields as irrigation systems came back online. People with little experience in governance found themselves managing warehouses, leading work brigades, or coordinating local development projects. Participation in national reconstruction became a shared pride that softened, for some, the hardships of daily life. The government nurtured this sense of unity carefully. Public ceremonies honored model workers, soldiers, and students. Medals were awarded to individuals who exceeded production quotas or organized successful community projects. Speeches lauded them as examples for the entire nation. These events were broadcast through state-run channels and reported in newspapers that emphasized discipline, loyalty, and unwavering devotion to the Republic's goals. As the 1950s progressed, the administration tightened ideological training. Political study sessions became mandatory in workplaces and residential areas. Attendees read approved texts, memorized key concepts, and participated in discussions praising the nation's achievements. Absences or signs of reluctance were noted by committee leaders who reported irregularities to higher authorities. This environment produced a culture where public loyalty was expected, monitored, and reinforced continuously. The northern population adapted unevenly. Many residents accepted the system as necessary for national defense and reconstruction. Others complied out of caution, knowing the risks of standing out. Some genuinely embraced the vision presented by the leadership, finding meaning in participating in a collective effort larger than their individual hardships. Work teams celebrated each small success. New irrigation channels completed, crops harvested earlier than expected, factory output surpassing expectations. Despite the difficulties, the leadership presented the Republic as a rising state, determined to shape its destiny without foreign domination. Posters proclaimed the promise of self-reliance. Meetings echoed with messages about the nation's bright future. Factories increased their shifts, farms reported higher yields, and students filled classrooms equipped with new materials. The hardship of war had left deep scars, but a sense of direction had emerged, one centered on strict governance, rapid reconstruction, and unwavering commitment to centralized authority. By the late decade, the northern state stood transformed from the ruins of conflict into a consolidated political system with rigid structures, expanding industry, and a clearly defined ideology. Borders remained tense, families remained divided, and resources remained limited. Yet confidence radiated from official speeches and public displays. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea framed itself as resilient, unified, and prepared for the long struggle toward a future it intended to build on its own terms. Reconstruction sites still dotted the skyline when a wave of ambitious planners began pushing the Republic in a new direction. Government offices filled with charts, projected growth schedules, and proposals aimed at transforming the fragile post-war economy into something far more competitive. Ministers debated which industries to prioritize, how to manage foreign loans, and how to stabilize prices in markets still recovering from shortages. Their decisions would shape the Republic for decades, yet few involved in these meetings fully grasped how quickly the country was about to change. Factories that had been patched together after the war entered their next phase: expansion. Owners sought government assistance to modernize machinery, while engineers returning from overseas training introduced new production techniques. Small workshops evolved into mid-sized facilities, producing textiles, processed foods, and simple electronics. Each improvement increased demand for skilled labor, attracting workers from rural areas who boarded crowded buses and trains heading towards cities where job opportunities were multiplying. Urban landscapes shifted accordingly. Wooden shacks built during the worst periods of displacement were replaced with concrete housing blocks. Electric signs flickered above storefronts advertising goods previously scarce or unaffordable. Crowded streets grew busier each month as buses, taxis, and delivery trucks wove through traffic. Children walked to newly constructed schools in uniforms stitched from locally manufactured cloth. The Republic's largest cities no longer resembled the ruins seen at the war's end. They became hubs where commerce, culture, and industry converged. Amid these changes, education emerged as one of the most transformative forces. Classrooms expanded in number and size, requiring fleets of teachers trained through accelerated programs. Students were introduced to mathematics, science, and technical subjects, designed to prepare them for an economy steadily moving toward industrial specialization. Parents pushed their children to study late into the night, convinced that academic success would open doors unavailable to their own generation. Public libraries, once housed in damaged buildings, reopened with donated books, providing quiet spaces where students gathered after school. Economic policies played a critical role in this shift. Government ministries identified sectors with the potential to drive long-term growth and directed loans toward firms willing to take risks. Some companies were nudged to diversify, moving from textiles into plastics or electronics. Others received incentives to pursue heavy industries such as shipbuilding or steel production. These decisions often place tremendous pressure on business leaders, who face strict expectations to meet production schedules tied directly to national development plans. Rural communities felt the effects of these policies as well. Modern farming equipment became more widely available, supported by credit programs that allowed families to purchase machinery, or livestock agricultural cooperatives introduced systematic land management practices, boosting yields and improving food security. Improved irrigation networks ensured that more villages could maintain stable harvests, even when rainfall patterns varied. These gains loosened the grip of famine fears that had lingered for years after the conflict. While prosperity grew sporadically across regions, social attitudes began to shift. Young people who had grown up amid wartime deprivation now embraced the possibility of mobility, geographic, economic, and social. They flocked to cities, joined universities, and sought employment in emerging industries. Departments in steel plants, electronics workshops, and chemical factories hired trainees who showed promise. Regardless of family background, competence became a valuable commodity, often outweighing traditional hierarchies. Yet not all developments unfolded smoothly. Rapid industrialization strained existing infrastructure. Power outages struck neighborhoods when factories ran heavy nighttime shifts. Public transportation systems struggled to accommodate swelling populations. Housing shortages persisted in many districts, leading to dense settlements on city outskirts. Local officials drafted proposals to build more affordable homes, but demand consistently outpaced supply. Residents adapted as best they could, sharing rooms, rotating shifts for bed space, or forming co-living arrangements among extended families. Political currents moved beneath the surface of this economic activity. Rhee's government confronted rising unrest from students, workers, and opposition groups frustrated by entrenched corruption and authoritarian practices. Demonstrations increased in size and frequency. At university gates, students chanted for fair representation, transparency, and an end to policies. They felt stifled democratic expression. Police units often responded with arrests or dispersal tactics, heightening tensions that had been simmering since the war's end. Economic pressures added to the volatility. Inflation periodically surged as rapid growth pushed prices higher. Small businesses struggled to keep up with competition from larger firms supported by government loans. Rural families felt left behind when urban wages rose, while agricultural profits remained modest. These disparities sowed discontent among communities that had expected Reconstruction to deliver more equitable results. Despite the political turbulence, the Republic's economy strengthened with remarkable speed. Shipyards launched vessels capable of competing on the global market. electronics companies produced radios, refrigerators, and components for foreign manufacturers. Steel factories expanded to meet domestic and regional demand. Export revenues increased steadily, giving the government the financial flexibility to reinvest in infrastructure, education, and public health. International observers expressed astonishment that a nation devastated only years earlier could rise so quickly. Cultural life adapted to this cycle of growth and tension. Cinema halls reopened, showcasing domestic films alongside foreign releases. Musicians blended traditional instruments with modern styles, creating melodies that echoed in markets and tea shops. Modern art circles formed in small galleries, where young painters experimented with new techniques. These cultural expressions did not erase the hardships of the past, but they helped articulate aspirations for a more confident national identity. Families experienced the shift in personal terms. Parents who had rebuilt homes from rubble now watched their children pursue careers in manufacturing, teaching, or engineering. Dinner conversations revolved around exam results, business opportunities, and the future of the Republic. Although anxiety lingered, optimism gained ground, fueled by the steady rhythm of economic advancement. Political pressure eventually reached a breaking point. Demonstrations across universities and major cities drew crowds larger than authorities anticipated. Citizens demanded changes in leadership, accountability for corruption, and recognition of constitutional rights. When security forces attempted to suppress the protests, public outrage intensified. The government faced the stark reality that economic progress alone could not quell demands for political reform. Transition followed. Leadership changed hands amid widespread calls for a more representative government. Committees gathered to draft amendments expanding civil liberties and strengthening institutional checks. New elections reshaped the political landscape, bringing in figures who promised transparency and responsiveness. Although challenges persisted, these shifts indicated that South Korea was entering a new stage in its development, one marked not only by industrial growth, but by growing civic engagement. Foreign partnerships continued to guide much of the Republic's progress. Aid flowed into infrastructure projects, research initiatives, and military modernization. But these partnerships also raised questions about national autonomy and dependency. Scholars debated whether the Republic's future relied too heavily on foreign support, or whether such alliances were necessary during this critical phase of transformation. These debates reflected the complexity of a nation navigating the dual demands of independence and global integration. As the decade approached its end, urban skylines offered visible proof of rapid advancement. Cranes lifted steel beams into place for highways and office towers. Universities expanded their laboratories. Ports buzzed with activity as cargo ships loaded containers destined for distant markets. The Republic, once overshadowed by destruction, had built the foundations of an economy capable of sustaining long-term growth. Yet beneath the achievements lay reminders of the conflict that had shaped every decision. The armistice line remained tense, and the possibility of renewed fighting hovered over strategic discussions. Conscription drew thousands of young men into military service each year, reinforcing a security apparatus that had grown alongside the economy. Every new industrial milestone existed alongside the knowledge that stability required constant vigilance. South Korea emerged from this era changed at its core. Factories, schools, and political reforms reshaped the landscape, but the deeper transformation occurred in the collective mindset. People who had once doubted whether the Republic would survive the war now saw glimpses of a future defined by opportunity rather than ruin. Though inequality, political strife, and external threats persisted, the country had entered a period of momentum that would carry it beyond the shadows of conflict and into a new era of possibility. Rail lines running through the northern countryside carried fewer commercial shipments as the 1970s approached. Trains still moved regularly, but many wagons held military supplies, construction materials for state projects, or goods destined for internal distribution rather than export. Work brigades continued to arrive at mines and factories before sunrise. Yet the energy that had fueled early reconstruction began to strain under the weight of growing demands. Officials in Pyongyang recognized these pressures and intensified efforts to preserve national unity through renewed political campaigns. Speakers mounted on tall poles delivered daily broadcasts praising workers and soldiers while emphasizing vigilance. Families listened during breakfast as announcers urged them to meet production goals and remain alert to external threats. Posters depicting heroic labor crews appeared on building walls, reinforcing the expectation that sacrifice and discipline were essential for the nation's survival. These messages reached schools, factories, and rural collectives, shaping a routine where ideology blended seamlessly with everyday tasks. Industrial centers pushed forward with state-directed initiatives, but shortages began to surface. Engineers struggled to maintain aging equipment that had operated continuously since the post-war reconstruction. Replacement parts were difficult to obtain, and technicians improvised repairs to keep machines running. Power outages occurred more frequently, interrupting production just as output quotas grew more ambitious. Managers encouraged workers to exceed expectations despite these difficulties, citing examples of factories that had completed tasks ahead of schedule through determination alone. Agricultural communities faced similar strains. Collective farms expanded their planting schedules, adding additional plots to meet national targets. Farmers often worked long hours, repairing irrigation channels, clearing stones, and tending to fields that yielded inconsistent harvests. Fertilizer shipments did not always arrive when needed, forcing villagers to rely on traditional methods that produced smaller yields. Yet the expectation to meet state goals remained firm, and local leaders praised collective achievements even when results fell short of promises made publicly. Amid these economic pressures, political consolidation deepened. The party emphasized ideological education with renewed intensity, requiring attendance at weekly sessions where texts were studied, speeches reviewed, and discussions held about loyalty to the state. These meetings shaped the tone of workplace interactions and reinforced social expectations. People learned to speak carefully, avoid criticism, and display visible enthusiasm during public events. Genuine support, cautious compliance, and silent doubt blended together beneath the surface of outward uniformity. Foreign relations shifted dramatically during these decades. Both the Soviet Union and China pursued their own strategic interests, leaving North Korea to navigate an increasingly complicated diplomatic landscape. Trade agreements that once guaranteed access to essential materials grew unpredictable. Disputes between major socialist powers affected the republic's ability to rely on either side fully. Pyongyang responded by reinforcing its commitment to self-reliance, promoting policies that aimed to reduce dependence on external partners, even as the economy required inputs difficult to produce domestically. Isolation became more deliberate with each passing year. Travel outside the country remained rare and tightly controlled. Foreign visitors were escorted through designated routes that showcased model farms, meticulously maintained factories, and neighborhoods prepared for official tours. Citizens seldom encountered outsiders, except during carefully arranged events. Schools taught simplified narratives about the outside world, portraying foreign powers as unpredictable and potentially hostile. This atmosphere shaped expectations for future generations, many of whom grew up believing that the country's survival demanded constant unity. Despite challenges, signs of progress remained visible. Cities expanded outward, with new apartment blocks built in square, orderly rows. Public buildings were constructed with imposing facades meant to symbolize strength and permanence. Cultural performances continued to grow in scale, featuring elaborate choreography, large orchestras, and meticulously trained ensembles. These productions provided emotional uplift and served as demonstrations of national discipline. Military expansion intensified alongside these developments. Conscription brought increasing numbers of young men into uniform, and training facilities operated at full capacity. Exercises along the border grew more sophisticated, using equipment developed through domestic research or obtained through limited trade channels. Military parades in Pyongyang showcased rows of armored vehicles, missile units, and disciplined formations marching in perfect synchronization. These displays reinforced the message that national security remained paramount, and that the Republic would defend itself without hesitation. Daily life followed predictable rhythms shaped by both necessity and ideology. Workers lined up outside factories before dawn, waiting for supervisors to assign tasks. Children recited slogans during morning assemblies at schoolyards. Families cooked meals, using careful portions to stretch limited rations. Evenings often passed quietly, with neighbors gathering to discuss community responsibilities or upcoming state events. People adapted to shortages with creative solutions, repairing clothing repeatedly, recycling tools, and repurposing household items whenever possible. Information remained tightly controlled. Newspapers printed only government-approved stories, highlighting national achievements or addressing official priorities. Radio broadcasts offered updates on production progress, military readiness, and cultural events. Foreign news, when mentioned, was framed through interpretations that stressed ideological contrast. This controlled environment left little room for independent understanding of the outside world, reinforcing the perception that external forces threatened the Republic's stability. Uncertainty grew when trading partners reduced shipments or altered agreements. Factories sometimes paused operations while waiting for materials that never arrived. Farms struggled in years when weather patterns shifted unexpectedly. Local committees developed contingency plans to ensure survival during these periods, storing food reserves and prioritizing distribution to vulnerable households. These measures demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of a system built around resilience rather than flexibility. Despite the weight of these circumstances, citizens found ways to maintain community bonds. Festivals continued in public squares, featuring performances by children and local art groups. Villagers gathered for group activities organized by neighborhood units. Families visited scenic areas during national holidays, though travel remained limited to approved destinations. These moments provided rare opportunities for rest and connection amid the demands of daily life. Economic pressures persisted through the 1980s, deepened by external circumstances beyond the government's control. Global markets shifted, as support from traditional allies wavered. The international climate grew more complex, and the northern economy struggled to keep pace. Production targets remained ambitious, even when the resources needed to achieve them became scarce. Officials responded by reinforcing ideological campaigns and urging citizens to embrace national goals more fervently. By the close of this era, North Korea had solidified a path distinct from its southern counterpart. The Republic relied on centralized authority, widespread mobilization, and strict control to maintain its direction. Factories produced goods primarily for domestic use or limited trade. Farms operated under collective systems, and political life revolved around unwavering commitment to national unity. Isolation had become not just a circumstance, but a defining feature of the state's identity, shaping how its people lived, worked, and understood their place in the world. Factories across South Korea buzzed with activity when the decade of the 1990s arrived, but cracks beneath the surface soon emerged. Corporations that had expanded rapidly during earlier boom years struggled under the weight of ambitious loans. Markets moved unpredictably, and foreign investors reacted sharply to every sign of instability. Government officials studied fluctuating numbers with rising concern, aware that a financial crisis spreading across Asia could pull the Republic into turmoil. When the crash finally hit, stock prices collapsed, companies filed for bankruptcy, and workers faced layoffs on a scale the country had not seen since the years following the war. Crowds gathered outside shuttered workplaces, reading notices posted on locked doors. Families who had earned stable incomes found themselves scrambling to adjust. Savings evaporated. Plans for university, home purchases, and business ventures were postponed indefinitely. Leaders responded with sweeping reforms intended to steer the country toward economic resilience. Chaebol conglomerates were pressed to restructure, public spending was redirected, and new regulations reshaped banking practices. These measures demanded sacrifice, but they also ushered in an era that prioritized transparency, competitiveness, and global integration. As the economy stabilized, a cultural transformation gathered momentum. Korean dramas gained audiences abroad, carried overseas by broadcasters experimenting with new programming. Songs produced by emerging entertainment companies began to chart in neighboring countries. Films created by local directors earned awards at international festivals. These accomplishments sparked pride and curiosity among young people, who viewed the arts as a way to project the Republic's identity beyond its borders. Cafes, bookstores, and small venues filled with aspiring artists eager to join the movement, reshaping the country's cultural presence. Technological innovation reinforced this shift. Internet cafes sprang up in alleyways near universities, filled with students who stayed late into the night, exploring a connected world. New companies specializing in software, mobile devices, and telecommunications expanded rapidly. Engineers and programmers entered the workforce in growing numbers, forming teams that would eventually develop products recognized across continents. City skylines reflected this modernization as glass towers rose beside older structures, symbolizing a republic moving from recovery to reinvention. Political life evolved alongside these changes. Citizens grew increasingly vocal about accountability, leading to reforms that broadened civil liberties and strengthened democratic institutions. Elections brought in leaders who pledged to reduce corruption, modernize governance, and deepen social safety nets. Student groups, civic organizations, and labor unions influenced debates on education reform, workers' rights, gender equality, and environmental policy. These movements revealed a population increasingly unwilling to accept opaque decision-making or unchecked authority. Generational differences became evident as young adults pursued aspirations that differed sharply from those of parents shaped by war and Reconstruction. Many sought careers in creative industries, technology sectors, or global companies, rather than traditional paths. They adopted new cultural influences, engaged in international travel, and embraced evolving ideas about personal freedom. Conversations in cafes and university classrooms reflected a society grappling with how to balance rapid modernization with long-standing traditions. North of the armistice line, life followed a contrasting trajectory. Political authority remained centralized as leadership passed from one generation to the next. Within the ruling family, portraits, statues, and commemorative murals reinforced continuity between eras. Military parades in Pyongyang showcased ranks of soldiers marching in flawless formation, accompanied by columns of artillery and missile units rolling across wide boulevards. These events signaled not only strength, but also a message to the outside world. The Republic intended to defend its system without compromise. Economic conditions, however, grew increasingly strained. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed a reliable source of support. At a moment when trade relationships were already narrow, factories struggled to secure raw materials. Farms faced fertilizer shortages that stalled crop yields. Transportation networks required repairs that communities could not easily manage. During harsh years, families rationed meals, gathered firewood from surrounding hills, and adapted to prolonged blackouts. Children studied by candlelight, while adults stood in long lines for basic supplies. Despite hardship, many residents maintained a steady routine grounded in familiar structures. Neighborhood units organized community tasks. Teachers kept classrooms functioning as best they could, and work brigades met their obligations regardless of conditions. Radios delivered official broadcasts each morning, mixing patriotic anthems with directives from Pyongyang. The emphasis remained on collective discipline, resilience, and vigilance, reinforcing a worldview shaped by decades of self-reliance and distrust of foreign interference. Diplomatic engagements fluctuated unpredictably. Attempts at dialogue with regional powers sometimes resulted in temporary agreements, including discussions on nuclear activity, humanitarian aid, or family reunions. Delegations met in neutral villages or foreign capitals, exchanging promises that occasionally held for months before dissolving. Each cycle of negotiation brought small bursts of hope, followed by renewed caution. For families divided by the armistice, these brief periods allowed rare opportunities to glimpse relatives they had not seen in decades, even if only for a few emotional hours. Meanwhile, smuggled media from abroad slipped quietly into northern towns. Portable storage devices, radios tuned to foreign frequencies, and whispered exchanges carried glimpses of life beyond the tightly controlled information channels. Young people encountered stories, songs, and images that contrasted starkly with the official narrative. These influences circulated discreetly within trusted circles, reminding residents that the world outside was shifting rapidly, even as their own society remained anchored to established ideology. In urban Pyongyang, selective modernization appeared in designated districts. Apartment blocks with polished facades rose along major streets. New theaters hosted performances, featuring elaborate choreography and modern lighting systems. Public squares filled during mass celebrations, where thousands moved in perfect synchronization, forming patterns visible from rooftops. These displays projected confidence despite underlying challenges, reinforcing the leadership's message that discipline and unity remained central to national identity. Back in the South, daily life continued to evolve. Cafes played music from international artists alongside local hits. Subways and highways carried commuters to offices in cutting-edge industries. Students competed fiercely for positions in universities, known for research and global partnerships. Families embraced digital technologies that reshaped communication, entertainment, and education. Smartphones became ubiquitous, influencing how people connected, worked, and expressed themselves. Tensions along the border, however, remained constant. Military units on both sides maintained rigorous training schedules. Patrols monitored activity across the demilitarized zone, watching for signs of movement or unexpected shifts. Occasional incidents, shelling, defections, or aerial violations forced both governments to respond swiftly. These flare-ups served as reminders that the conflict had never been resolved, only paused. Each generation inherited the responsibility of living under the shadow of a division that defined the region. Efforts toward reconciliation rose and fell according to political winds. Some leaders pursued dialogue, proposing joint economic zones, family reunions, and cultural exchanges. Others prioritized deterrence, citing security concerns and ideological differences. South Korean citizens held varying opinions. Some favored engagement, others advocated caution. The debate highlighted a society still divided in its hopes for the peninsula's long-term future. Technology increasingly shaped these conversations. Social media platforms amplified opinions from across the political spectrum. News traveled instantly, influencing public sentiment within hours. Younger generations discussed peace, identity, and reunification in ways distinct from those who had lived through war. At the same time, the presence of foreign troops in the south and the military first posture in the north ensured that geopolitics remained central to any vision of change. Despite uncertainty, many South Koreans continued to build lives marked by opportunity and cultural influence. Artists, entrepreneurs, scientists, and entertainers contributed to a global presence that few could have imagined. In the decades after the war, K-pop groups sold out concerts in distant capitals. Filmmakers won international awards, and technology firms shaped markets around the world. These achievements provided a sense of pride that contrasted sharply with the hardships endured earlier in the century. In the north, communities held fast to routines shaped by tradition, collective organization, and state direction. Daily resilience became a source of quiet strength. While limited contact with the outside world persisted, the population's adaptation to scarcity forged a distinct identity, one rooted in survival, discipline, and loyalty, to a system that defined every aspect of life. Today, the peninsula stands divided not only by fences and protocols, but by experiences, expectations, and worldviews shaped over generations. Streets in Seoul glow with neon lights and digital screens, while rural northern towns focus on meeting quotas and staying prepared for rapidly changing directives. Yet beneath the differences lies a shared origin. One homeland split by war, ideology, and the decisions of distant powers. Each side moves forward on its own path, navigating challenges shaped by history. One builds its future through global engagement, innovation, and democratic debate. The other reinforces continuity through discipline, planning, and controlled stability. The border between them remains one of the most fortified on Earth. Yet families on both sides still imagine a day when movement across it might no longer require permission, negotiation, or risk. The modern era has not erased the past. It has extended it, reshaping the peninsula into two nations that reflect both the resilience of their people and the lasting impact of choices made during earlier turning points. And although their futures continue to unfold separately, the story of Korea remains intertwined, carried in the memories, aspirations, and shared history of millions who live with the legacy of a division that has endured far beyond its intended lifespan.